Khalid Viras grabbed the interpreter by the throat, the movement so sudden and violent it seemed to blur the air in the small, stone-walled room. He lifted the man off the ground with a single, massive hand, his strength fueled by decades of survival and a total lack of empathy. The interpreter's feet kicked uselessly at the dusty floor, his hands clawing at the iron grip around his neck. Viras didn't flinch. He didn't show anger. He simply pressed the cold, oil-slicked barrel of a pistol between the man's wide, terrified eyes. The metal left a circular indentation on the man's skin, a mark of impending finality. "Tell me who sent the sniper," Viras said, his voice a soft, melodic whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. It was the voice of a man who had already decided the outcome. The interpreter sobbed, a wet, choking sound, and shook his head in a desperate, final plea for mercy. Viras didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The muffled crack of the suppressed weapon was the only sound in the room, followed by the heavy thud of the body dropping to the dirt floor. Viras stepped over the remains without a second glance, his boots clicking on the stone. He walked to the window and looked out across the jagged peaks of the mountain valley, his expression completely calm, completely unhurried. He looked like a man who had just swatted a fly that had been mildly annoying him. For 20 years, this man had hidden from the reach of American justice. 20 years since he had orchestrated the brutal ambush that killed one of the greatest snipers the Marine Corps had ever produced. He thought he was untouchable, protected by the unforgiving terrain and the silence of the dead. He had never met the man's daughter. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The workshop smelled like gun oil, burnt copper, and the heavy, lingering scent of decades of quiet discipline. It was a smell that lived in the pores of the walls and the fibers of the workbenches. It was 6:15 in the morning when Evelyn Carter arrived, the sky outside a bruised purple as the sun prepared to climb over the Arizona desert. She arrived the same way she arrived every single day, 30 minutes before anyone else was even thinking about their first cup of coffee. Her keys were already in her hand, the metal cold against her palm, and her thermos was already half empty, the bitter black coffee providing the only warmth in the early morning chill. She wore the same thing she always wore, oversized mechanic coveralls the color of old, weathered concrete. They were stained with the ghosts of 1,000 repairs, dark spots of CLP and hydraulic fluid that would never come out. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low, practical bun, tight enough to stay out of her eyes, but loose enough to be forgotten. Her hands were already calloused in the places that mattered, the skin thickened by the constant friction of steel and the delicate, repetitive work of a master armorer. She was 28 years old, stood only 5 feet 4 inches tall, and possessed a stillness that most people mistook for insignificance. Every man who walked through the door of that Marine Corps workshop on the edge of the Yuma training compound had at some point made the exact same mistake. They looked at her and saw a girl in oversized clothes, a civilian contractor playing at a man's game. They saw nothing dangerous. Eve had learned to be fine with that. In fact, she preferred it. The workshop sat on the back end of the compound, far from the polished offices and the parade grounds. It was a long, low building with corrugated metal walls that groaned in the wind and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low-frequency hum whenever the temperature dropped. 2 massive industrial fans stood at either end of the bay, their blades thick with dust, barely moving the stagnant, heavy heat in the peak of summer. Along the walls hung rifles in various stages of repair. There were bolt-action precision rifles stripped down to their actions, semi-automatic platforms with their internals exposed, and high-end optics pulled apart on felt mats, their lenses laid out like the components of a delicate surgery. Every weapon had a tag, and every tag had a name. Every name belonged to a shooter who trusted their life to the mechanical perfection of that tool. Eve knew every single one of them. She knew which rifles tended to pull slightly to the left when the barrel got hot, which ones had a trigger brake that was just a hair too heavy, and which ones were being carried by men who didn't know how to clean their own equipment. She set her thermos on the scarred wooden workbench, pulled on her nitrile gloves with a sharp snap, and got to work. This was her life. This had been her entire world for 4 years, ever since she'd made the choice that had confused everyone who knew her. She had turned down a full university scholarship, turned down the prospect of a comfortable desk job in Virginia, and quietly applied for a civilian contractor position repairing and maintaining precision sniper systems for the Marine Corps. The hiring officer had been a man who had seen everything, but even he had paused when he saw her application. He had looked at her paperwork for a long time without speaking, his eyes tracking over her qualifications. Then he'd looked at her last name, Carter. Any relation to Gabrielle Carter? He'd asked, his voice losing some of its professional edge. He was my father, she'd said, her voice flat and devoid of the pride people expected. There had been another long silence as the officer absorbed that information. Gabrielle Carter wasn't just a name in the Corps. He was a legend, a ghost, a man whose shadow still loomed over the scout sniper community. You know this isn't a legacy position, the officer had said carefully, as if trying not to offend her. We don't hire people based on who their parents were. I know, she'd interrupted, her gaze locking onto his. Hire me based on what I can do, or don't hire me at all. She'd gotten the job, but she hadn't gotten respect. Not at first, and not easily. The respect didn't come from the instructors who passed through for the advanced courses, or from the SEAL teams that rotated in and out for their pre-deployment training cycles. It certainly didn't come from the young Marine snipers who dropped their weapons on her bench with a grunt, treating her like she was a vending machine, a service to be utilized rather than a person to be acknowledged. The mockery was rarely direct. That wasn't how military culture worked, at least not with the men who considered themselves professionals. It was more like the weather, constant, impersonal, and something you either adapted to or got crushed by. She heard it in the pauses when she walked into a room full of operators, the way the conversation would shift or stall. She heard it in the way men would walk past her and ask, "Is the gunsmith available?" Instead of using her name, even when she was standing right in front of them with a torque wrench in her hand. She heard it in the conversations that continued just slightly too loudly as she passed by in the hallways. "Carter's kid," one sergeant had said to another once, not even bothering to lower his voice as she walked to the supply cage. "Poor girl thinks working on his guns is the same as being him." Eve had kept walking. She had learned very early that responding to that kind of thing cost more than it was worth. Words were cheap, and in her world, they were usually a distraction from the mechanical truth of the work. Instead, she did exactly what her father had taught her to do from the moment she was old enough to hold a cleaning rod. She came in early, she stayed late, and she did the work better than anyone else could possibly do it. She knew every rifle in that compound the way a surgeon knows the human body. She understood their tolerances, their tendencies, and the way temperature and humidity would change their behavior at extreme ranges. She knew the way a worn firing pin could look perfectly normal under the harsh glare of a fluorescent light, but would betray a shooter when they were lying in the mud 3 miles from help. She had a gift for it, a tactile intuition that felt like a conversation between her fingers and the steel. She'd always known she had it. She just hadn't found the right moment to use it yet. That morning started exactly like every other morning, a routine of checking logs and inspecting inventory. She was mid-reassembly on a Mark 13 Mod 7, the parts laid out in a precise, chronological order on her bench, when the door swung open and Sergeant Dale Briggs walked in. He was already talking on his phone, his voice booming in the quiet space, ignoring her presence entirely as if she were part of the furniture. Briggs was the kind of man who treated every space he walked into as his personal property, a byproduct of a career spent being the loudest and strongest person in the room. He was broad-shouldered, perpetually sunburned from hours on the range, and possessed the loose, easy confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life been told he didn't belong somewhere. He dropped a heavy, tan rifle case onto her bench without looking at her, the impact rattling her tools. "Scopes off," he said into his phone, his back turned to her. "Yeah, I know. Tuesday. Tell him Tuesday." Eve didn't say a word. She set down the Mark 13 bolt assembly and unlatched the heavy plastic case. Inside was a Barrett M107A1, a semi-automatic, 50 caliber anti-material precision rifle. It was a beast of a weapon, a massive piece of engineering designed to disable vehicles and penetrate light armor. In the right hands, it could reach targets at distances that defied conventional comprehension. She lifted it carefully, her muscles tensing against the weight, and ran her thumb along the mounting rail. "When do you need it?" she asked, her voice steady and quiet. Briggs glanced at her over his shoulder, still half immersed in his phone conversation. "Today. The scope mount is cracked," she said, her fingers finding the hairline fracture that most people would have missed. Not the scope itself, the mount. Someone torqued it wrong. Probably tried to tighten it in the field without a calibrated wrench. Briggs rolled his eyes, signaling his annoyance to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Can you fix it?" "Yes, then fix it." He turned back to his phone and walked outside into the rising heat, the door slamming shut behind him. Eve looked at the Barrett for a long moment. She knew this rifle, not this specific serial number, but the platform, the soul of the machine. She had grown up in rooms where Barretts leaned against the walls like quiet, reliable uncles. Her father had talked about them the way other men talked about old friends, reliable, honest, and completely unforgiving of carelessness. They were weapons that demanded respect in return for their loyalty. She began working, her movements fluid and practiced, her mind already moving on to the next task. It was a Thursday afternoon when the world she had built for herself finally cracked open. Eve was alone in the workshop, the other contractors having headed out for a late lunch. She'd stayed behind as she often did, eating a sandwich over a partially disassembled optics housing, the silence of the shop a comfort. Then, she heard the main compound door open. It wasn't the aggressive, heavy-footed entrance of an operator like Briggs. These footsteps were different. One set was heavy, measured, and deliberate, the sound of a man who didn't need to hurry because the world waited for him. The other was lighter, quicker, but carried a distinct authority in its pace. "Miss Carter." She looked up, brushing a stray hair from her face with the back of her hand. General Victor Hale stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room in a way that made the walls feel smaller. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in this world knew Victor Hale. He was a retired Marine two-star general, a former 1st Marine Division commander, and one of the most decorated officers of his generation. He was 63 now, with hair that had turned to a distinguished gray at the temples, and carrying 20 extra pounds he hadn't had back when he was leading men in the field. But his posture was still the posture of a commander, someone who expected the room to arrange itself around him the moment he entered. He was holding a thick manila folder, the edges slightly frayed. "General Hale," Eve said carefully, setting down her sandwich and wiping her hands on a clean rag. "Don't stand," he said, stepping further into the workshop. He looked around the space with a discerning eye, the way men his age often looked at things, as if he were measuring the present against a memory he held dear. The man behind him was younger, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a lean build and a sharp crew cut. He was wearing civilian clothes, but he couldn't hide what he was. He had the eyes of someone who worked in intelligence or special operations, or perhaps a dangerous mix of both. "I'll be direct," Hale said, his voice gravelly but kind. "I'd appreciate that," Eve replied. Something crossed his face then, a flicker of something that was almost a smile. "Your father said the same thing to me the first time we met, almost the exact same words." She kept her face neutral, refusing to let the mention of her father throw her off. "What can I do for you, General?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the manila folder on her workbench, right next to the tools she had been using. She looked at him for a beat before opening it. Inside was a single satellite photograph, high altitude and incredibly high resolution. It showed a market district nestled in a mountainous region, the terrain looking jagged and cold even in the frozen image. Encircled in a sharp red line, standing beside a dark SUV at the edge of a shifting crowd, was a man. Eve looked at the photograph for exactly 6 seconds. She memorized the tilt of the man's head, the way he stood with a predatory ease, and the specific architecture of the buildings behind him. Then she looked up at Hale. "Is that who I think it is?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "His name is Khalid Varas," Hale said, the name sounding like a curse. "He surfaced in Kunar province 3 weeks ago. He's been confirmed by 2 separate intelligence streams, including a ground asset we trust. He is alive, he is active, and he is organizing again. Khalid Varas Sumi." Eve had grown up with that name in her blood, like a slow-acting toxin she'd never been able to purge from her system. She had first heard it when she was 8 years old, sitting in a quiet kitchen in North Carolina. She remembered the way the light had hit the floor when a Marine captain in a dress uniform sat across from her mother and spoke the words that had rearranged the entire architecture of their lives. Her father had been killed in a classified operation in Kunar province, Afghanistan. The ambush had been orchestrated by a mid-level warlord who had at the time been a secondary priority for American intelligence, a ghost in the hills. By the time the significance of the attack and the identity of its architect were fully understood, Varas had vanished into the labyrinthine mountains along the border. For 20 years, he had stayed vanished. For 20 years, he had been a shadow that haunted her family's history. "Why are you here?" Eve asked. Her voice was steady, even as her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She was proud of that steadiness. "Because the unit tasked with this operation needs a sniper," Hale said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Their primary is currently recovering from a major surgery. Their secondary is deployed on a Tier 1 mission elsewhere and can't be pulled without compromising a long-term objective. We have a very narrow window, possibly 10 days, before Varas relocates into a region where we can't touch him without starting a border war." "There are other snipers," Eve said, her logic trying to fight through the sudden surge of adrenaline. "The Marine Corps is full of them." "There are," Hale agreed, "but none of them grew up putting rounds through a Barrett. 50 at distances their instructors told them were physically impossible." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the workshop lights. "How do you know about that?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. Hale reached into his jacket pocket and placed something else on the workbench beside the folder. It was an old photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed by the harsh desert sun. It showed a man lying prone on a rocky ridge, a Barrett M82 resting on a bipod beside him. His face was turned 3/4 away from the camera, looking out toward a horizon that wasn't visible in the frame. But Eve knew him instantly from the set of his shoulders and the way his hands rested on the weapon. It was her father, Gabriel. It was likely taken in the late 1990s, years before she was even born. "Gabriel sent me that photograph," Hale said quietly, his voice softening with the memory, "along with a letter. He wrote to me about training you. He wrote about watching you make a shot at 900 yards when you were only 16 years old. He said you used Kentucky windage alone because the rangefinder batteries had died in the heat and you refused to give up the position." Hale paused, let the words sink in. "He wrote that you were better than him, Eve." Eve couldn't speak for a moment. The air in the workshop felt thick, as if the oxygen had suddenly been sucked out of the room. "He never told me that," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "He told me," Hale said, "because he knew that someday I might need to find you. He knew the world was a dangerous place, and he knew your talent was a rare thing." She looked at the photograph of her father for a long, agonizing moment, then shifted her gaze to the satellite image of the man who had taken him from her. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was the culmination of 20 years of waiting. "When do I leave?" she said. She found out very quickly that not everyone shared General Hale's absolute faith in her. The first briefing was held in a classified facility outside Tucson, a 70-mile drive from the comfort of her workshop. Eve drove herself, following the precise coordinates she'd been given by a cryptic text message. She arrived to find a gravel lot occupied by 3 heavy tactical vehicles and a building that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable storage facility. Inside, however, it was an entirely different world. The briefing room was full of men, SEAL operators, men who lived and breathed in the shadows. She could read them immediately, noting the particular way they occupied physical space, as if they were always slightly on alert even when they were sitting down. Most were in their 30s, some older, with the weathered skin and hard eyes of career warriors. All of them looked at her with the exact same expression when she walked in, pure, unadulterated confusion. She found a plastic chair along the back wall and sat down, her back straight. Nobody spoke to her. They didn't even acknowledge her presence beyond the initial, skeptical glances. At the front of the room, standing beside a large digital display, was Commander Nathan Cross. She had heard the name before. Most people in the special operations community had. Nathan Cross was the kind of officer whose reputation preceded him by a significant margin. He was a SEAL commander with 3 combat deployments, 2 classified operations that were the stuff of legend, and a record that turned into footnotes in reports most people never got the clearance to read. He was 41 years old, tall and lean, with hair going gray at the temples and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes were the most striking thing about him. They seemed to be perpetually running a high-speed threat assessment on everything they landed on. Right now, they had landed squarely on her. "Who authorized this?" he asked. He didn't speak loudly, he spoke with a quiet intensity that was somehow far worse than a shout. General Hale, who was seated to the left of the display, answered calmly. "I did, Commander. I was told I was getting a sniper for this op." "You are getting a sniper," Cross said, his gaze shifting back to Eve. "But she's wearing workshop coveralls." She came straight from her shift, Hale said, his tone brooking no argument. Out of respect for the timeline we're working with. What's her combat experience? Cross asked, his voice hardening. She doesn't have combat experience, Hale admitted. She has, then she doesn't belong here, Cross said flatly, cutting him off. The room went very still. Eve could feel the eyes of every man in that room on her, waiting to see if she would break, if she would shrink under the weight of that dismissal. She didn't move. She kept her hands loose in her lap and her face a mask of neutral professional focus. She breathed slowly, counting the seconds. Commander, Hale said, and there was a weight in his voice that came from decades of command. She is here because I am telling you she is the best option we have for this specific shot. I understand your reservations. My reservations, Cross said, and now his voice had an edge that could cut glass, are that I have 12 operators in this room who have trusted me with their lives for years. I have a mission in a hostile mountain environment that is notoriously unforgiving. I have a window that closes in 10 days, and you've sent me a gunsmith. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like a simple, undeniable fact. To him, she was an anomaly, a risk he couldn't afford to take. Eve stood up. The movement was quiet and unhurried, but there was something about the quality of it, a certain grace and precision, that made several of the men in the room shift slightly in their seats. Commander Cross, she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. He looked at her directly for the first time, not through her or past her, but at her. My name is Evelyn Carter. My father was Gabriel Carter. You may know him by his call sign, Spectre. I have been told you served with him on your first deployment. Something moved across Cross's face then. A flicker of a memory, a moment of recognition that was gone almost before it could be registered. I know who your father was, he said, his voice losing some of its bite but none of its authority. Then you know he didn't become who he was because someone handed him a uniform and told him he belonged, Eve said. He became who he was because he could make shots that other people couldn't make. And he did it because he practiced them until they weren't exceptional anymore, until they were just a Tuesday. Cross studied her, his eyes narrowing as he looked for a weakness. Your father was one of the finest snipers I ever encountered, he said. I have deep respect for his service and his sacrifice, but respect for a man does not transfer to his daughter like an inheritance. I'm not asking for respect, Eve countered. I'm asking for a rifle and a qualification test. Silence stretched out in the room. One of the operators along the far wall, a big man with a Hawaiian shirt under his tactical vest and a scar running from his ear to his jaw, made a sound that might have been a laugh, though he quickly swallowed it. Cross looked at Hale, searching for some sign that this was a joke. Hale looked at Eve, his expression expectant. Eve looked at Cross, her gaze unwavering. Give her the test, Hale said quietly. Cross was silent for 3 full seconds, a lifetime in a room full of men who made split-second decisions. Fine, he said. Tomorrow morning, 0600, range 3. He picked up his folder from the table and walked toward the door. As he passed her, he said without stopping, without even looking at her, bring your own rifle. That night, Eve drove back to the workshop, the desert air cooling rapidly as the stars began to pierce the darkness. She pulled her custom case from its locked storage, a heavy, hard-shell transit case she'd built herself. It was reinforced at the corners with steel and padded internally with closed-cell foam she had cut to her exact specifications. She laid it on the scarred surface of her workbench and unlatched it. Inside was a Barrett M82A1. This wasn't a factory rifle. It was a ghost. Her father had begun building it in the late 1990s, a custom platform assembled over nearly 2 years from match-grade components. Each piece had been selected with the kind of obsessive precision that bordered on ceremony. The barrel had been hand-lapped until it was as smooth as glass. The trigger group had been worked and reworked until the break was like the edge of a thought, present, then gone, with nothing between the decision and the action. The stock had been modified for her father's particular build, and then modified again after his death by Eve herself. She was 3 inches shorter than he had been, and she had learned to shoot in his image before she finally learned to shoot in her own. She had carried this rifle in her mind for 20 years before she ever truly carried it in her hands. She ran a clean patch through the bore, the movement rhythmic and soothing. She checked the scope mounts, Hale's story about the cracked mount on Briggs's rifle flashing briefly through her memory and making her smile without any real humor. She checked the bolt face, the extractor, and the recoil pad. Then she sat on the edge of the workbench beside the open case and looked at the rifle for a long time. I don't know if I'm doing this for you or for me, she said quietly to the empty room. The workshop hummed around her, the fluorescent lights buzzing in their usual key. She thought about what Cross had said, that respect wasn't an inheritance. He wasn't wrong. She had always known that her father's name could only open a door. What she found on the other side of that door was entirely her own problem. But she had also spent her entire adult life preparing for this exact problem. She closed the case, latched it, and lifted it. It weighed 42 pounds, a significant burden for someone of her stature. She carried it like it weighed nothing at all. Range 3 was located in the rugged mountains north of the compound, accessible only by a winding, single-track road that cut through scrub brush and jagged rock for 4 miles. It opened onto a long, flat depression with a natural berm at the far end, a place where the wind liked to play tricks on anyone foolish enough to underestimate it. The air temperature at 0600 was 41 degrees and dropping, a biting chill that made your breath bloom in front of you. The wind was coming out of the northwest at 11 to 14 miles per hour, gusting occasionally to 18. Perfect, Eve thought. The cold and the wind were the two things most shooters complained about, but she had trained in conditions that made this look like a summer afternoon. There were 14 people on the range when she arrived. 12 of the operators from the briefing, 2 Marine sniper instructors who had been brought in to serve as official witnesses, and Commander Cross, who was standing with a tablet in his hand, looking at the distant targets. He didn't look up when she drove in. She unloaded the case from her truck, feeling the weight of the men's stares. A few of the operators watched her with open curiosity, while others seemed to be deliberately looking away. She set up her position methodically. The bipod was deployed, the rear bag positioned, and the scope dialed to its base setting. She adjusted for the current barometric pressure and altitude, her mind calculating the wind hold and elevation adjustments with a speed that came from years of practice. She didn't rush. She didn't look up to see if they were watching. When she was ready, she stood up and looked across at Cross. "Parameters?" she asked. He looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. 1,000 yards, he said. "Standard IPSC silhouette target center mass scoring zone, 10 rounds. You need 10 in the zone to even continue this conversation." He paused, a challenge in his eyes. Cold bore, cold bore. The first shot from a barrel at ambient temperature. No warm-up rounds to settle the metal, no fouling rounds to coat the bore. It was the most honest test of a shooter's fundamentals and their intimate knowledge of their rifle's specific behavior. "Moving target?" she asked. Something moved across the faces of the nearest operators, surprise quickly concealed by professional masks. Cross studied her for a moment. After the first 5 rounds, yes. Wind conditions remain variable. "We're not going to hold the mountains still for you, Carter." She simply nodded. She went back to her position and got behind the rifle, the cold steel of the M82A1 a familiar weight. She heard one of the instructors behind her say, low but not low enough, "She asks better pre-range questions than half the guys I've certified." Nobody responded to that. Eve breathed out, settling her body into the dirt. She felt the rifle's weight distribute into the bipod and the bag, felt the stock's familiar geometry against her cheek. The trigger was under her gloved finger, resting at the first wall of its break. She found the target in the scope, a white card 1,000 yards away, roughly the size of a man's torso. She checked the wind, feeling the breeze on the right side of her face, against her ear and the collar of her jacket. 11 miles per hour, coming slightly off the right front quarter. She held the appropriate number of minutes into the wind, her reticle steady on the target. She breathed in. She breathed out. She pulled the trigger on the natural pause of her exhale, in the stillness between one heartbeat and the next. The Barrett fired, the .50 caliber projectile traveling at 2,800 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, there was approximately a second of flight time. She stayed in the scope, watching the trace of the bullet as it cut through the air. The target moved exactly the way it should. Center. She cycled the massive bolt, feeling the heavy brass case eject and a new round chamber with a satisfying mechanical clunk. She heard nothing from the men behind her. She fired again, then again. With each shot, she took her time. She wasn't slow, she was professional. There is a distinct difference between a shooter who is hurrying and a shooter who has eliminated the concept of hurry from their body entirely. She managed her breathing, her position, and the minor windage corrections as the gusts changed character. 5 shots. She stood up from the rifle and waited. Behind her, the range officer drove forward to the target location to mark the impacts. Eve watched through her scope. 5 holes, all within the scoring zone, 3 of them clustered within an inch of each other. She heard someone say very quietly, "Huh." Then Cross's voice cut through the air. "Moving target starting now." She got back behind the rifle. The target, now mounted on an electric lateral traverse track, began moving left to right at a steady walking pace. She tracked it, building her lead in the reticle. She fired, hit. She tracked again, timed her shot, and fired, hit. 3 rounds left. Suddenly, the target changed direction, reversing right to left and increasing its pace slightly. She absorbed the change without lifting her head from the stock. She tracked the movement, rebuilding the lead with a particular kind of fluid patience that cannot be taught to someone who doesn't already possess it. She fired, hit. 2 rounds left. She felt a gust coming, sensing it in the way the air changed on the side of her face before the grass indicators even registered the shift. She waited. 2 seconds passed. The gust peaked and then began to fade. She fired, hit. For the last round, she settled into a deep stillness. Everything she had ever been taught, every night spent practicing alone in the desert, and every word her father had ever told her was present in that moment, not as a thought, but as a silent, powerful reality. She fired, hit. She stayed behind the rifle for 3 full seconds after the final shot, ensuring she followed through. Then she stood up, safed the weapon, and turned around. The range was completely quiet. 2 of the operators were looking at each other, their skepticism replaced by something far more complex. One of the Marine instructors had his arms crossed, staring at the target location with the expression of a man who needed to recalibrate his entire worldview. Commander Cross was looking at the Barrett, not at her, but at the rifle itself. He walked toward her slowly, stopping about 4 feet away. He was looking at the weapon with an expression she couldn't entirely read. It was complicated, controlled, but there was something burning underneath it, a recognition of a legacy he hadn't expected to see reborn in the desert dust. The silence that followed her statement was heavy, vibrating with the ghost of the shots she had just fired. Cross stared at the rifle, his breathing shallow and controlled, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something far less disciplined. He looked at the weapon as if it were a ghost, a piece of his own past reconstructed in steel and polymer. He noted the custom platform, the way the rail was integrated, the subtle modifications that spoke of a master's touch. When he asked whose it was, his voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the cooling breeze of the range. Eve didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a steady, unblinking intensity, her voice landing with the weight of an undisputed fact. She told him it was hers now. He remained quiet for a long beat, the realization sinking in. It had been his once. It wasn't a question of ownership in the legal sense, but of lineage. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before his fingers grazed the stock. He didn't pick it up or try to shoulder it. He simply touched it, a tactile confirmation of a memory he had likely tried to bury 1,000 times. For a fleeting moment, a shadow passed over his face, a raw expression that looked hauntingly like grief, or perhaps the sudden, sharp pain of a wound reopening. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slid back into place. He pulled his hand away, retreating into the cold, professional distance that was his armor. His next words were reflexive, a defense mechanism triggered by the unexpected emotional territory they had wandered into. He called it a cute toy. Eve could hear the hollowness in the remark. It was an automatic response, a way to diminish the power the rifle held over him and the skill she had just displayed. The rifle, the name of her father, and the shots she had placed with impossible precision. It was all too much to process in the open. But Eve didn't let the insult land. She didn't react with anger or the need to prove herself further. She simply lifted her eyes to his, her gaze ice-cold and unshaken. In that moment, she was her father's daughter in every way she had spent years trying to avoid, and in every way that was permanently etched into her DNA. She asked him if he really thought it was a simple wa-ikai. She let the silence hold, a deliberate beat that forced everyone in the vicinity to listen. She told him clearly that it was a Barrett 50, a machine that had ended wars before breakfast. More importantly, she told him it was the rifle that was going to give him his only shot at Khalid Varez. Without waiting for a rebuttal, she began to pack the weapon away. Her hands were careful and unhurried, moving with the practiced grace of someone who understood that a weapon of that caliber required respect. She latched the case with a series of metallic clicks that echoed like punctuation marks and walked toward the truck. Behind her, Reyes, the Hawaiian operator with the jagged scar and the easy grin, spoke loud enough for the entire group to hear. He remarked that the commander had just been corrected by a gunsmith. Nobody laughed out loud. The tension was still too thick for that. but at least 3 of the men came very close, their respect shifting toward the woman who had just stood her ground against the most intimidating man they knew. That afternoon, the mission briefing resumed in the dim light of the command center, but the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. This time, Eve sat at the primary table. No one questioned her presence, and no one made a show of acknowledging the change. Cross didn't offer an apology or a direct nod to the morning's events. That wasn't how he operated. He simply began the briefing as if this had always been the plan, as if the morning at the range had never happened. He allowed the facts to dictate the new reality, a trait Eve found herself respecting more than she had expected to. The mission was exactly as Hale had described, but the granular details filled in a picture that made the stomach tighten with the weight of the stakes. Khalid Varez had surfaced in a remote village deep within the Kunar province. It was a high mountain valley, a natural fortress accessible only by 2 narrow roads, both of which were heavily monitored by Varez's elite security detail. Intelligence suggested a narrow window of opportunity based on a religious observance. Varez would remain in the valley for 5 to 7 days before vanishing back into the shadows of a secondary location. If they were going to take the shot, it had to happen within that window, from a position that seemed mathematically impossible. The display screen hummed, projecting a satellite map of the ridgeline. The red dot indicating the sniper's nest was a jagged outcrop of rock approximately 3 kilometers from the target building. Specifically, the distance was 3,247 meters. Eve stared at that number for a long time, the digits burning into her mind. When she asked for confirmation of the distance, Cross gave it to her with a blunt, singular word. The room fell into a profound silence. Eve had nothing left to say. Words were useless against a number like that. Until she was standing on that ridge, feeling the thin mountain air, reading the wind data, and feeling the Barrett's cold steel against her cheek, the number was just an abstract concept. Yet she felt a familiar stirring in her chest, not fear, but something older and more profound. It was a sensation her father would have recognized instantly. It was the calm that settles over those who are tasked with the impossible, the stillness that precedes the storm. From the outside, she looked entirely composed, but inside, she was already beginning to calculate the physics of a 3-kilometer flight. That night, the weight of the coming mission drove her to seek a connection to the world she was leaving behind. She called her mother, Diane Carter. At 61, Diane still lived in the same white clapboard house in North Carolina where Eve had grown up. It was a house defined by the porch where they watched summer storms, and the backyard where a paper target had been stapled to a wooden post nearly every weekend of Eve's childhood. Diane answered on the second ring, her voice immediately asking about the workshop. It was her way of keeping things normal, of pretending her daughter was just a mechanic and not a hunter. Eve's voice was soft as she broke the news. She told her mother she had been asked to go somewhere, a classified operation. She couldn't give details, but she didn't have to. Diane Carter had spent 35 years married to a Marine and 20 years as his widow. She understood the unspoken language of their world. There was a long silence on the line before Diane asked if this had anything to do with the man responsible for what happened to Eve's father. Eve didn't ask how she knew. The connection was inevitable. She simply confirmed it. Her mother's breath hitched, a slow, shuddering exhale. She called her Evie, a name that felt like a bridge to a younger, safer version of herself. Diane admitted she knew she couldn't stop her, and she acknowledged that Eve's father would have had a lot of complicated things to say about the situation. When Eve suggested he would say she was ready, her mother agreed, but with a haunting caveat. She wanted Eve to be ready because she was truly prepared, not because she was consumed by anger. Eve looked out the windshield of the truck at the vast, dark expanse of the Arizona desert, claiming she knew the difference. But her mother's gentle follow-up, asking if she truly did, left the question hanging in the air. Eve didn't answer right away. She sat with the question, practicing the patience her father had always preached. He used to tell her never to take a shot she hadn't earned the certainty on. Finally, she admitted she was still figuring it out. Her mother told her to come home when she was done, but her final warning was the one that stuck. Don't try to be him. Her father had spent his entire life trying to protect her from the very path she was now walking. He didn't want her to become the shadow he had been forced to be. After hanging up, Eve sat in the darkness for an hour. The Arizona sky was an overwhelming canopy of stars, so bright and dense they felt artificial. Her father had taught her to read those stars, just as he had taught her to read the wind and the complex ballistic tables that now lived in her mind as naturally as the rhythm of her own breathing. He had taught her everything about survival and lethality, but he had never taught her how to stop mourning him. That was a lesson she was forced to learn in the silence of the desert. She finally started the truck, the engine's growl a call to action. She drove back to the compound, the time for reflection ending as the time for war began. By 22:00 hours, the mission briefing was officially over, but the gossip and speculation among the team were just beginning. Every man in that room had spent the last few hours forming a new opinion of Evelyn Carter. Dominic Reyes, the scarred Hawaiian who had witnessed her prowess on the range, was the most vocal. He caught Cross in the hallway, his voice low but insistent. He told the commander plainly that she was the real thing. Cross didn't even slow his pace, countering that a range qualification wasn't the same as the chaos of combat. Reyes pushed back, pointing out that she had put 10 rounds cold bore at 1,000 yards in a crosswind, with the last 5 on a moving target, a feat most certified shooters with multiple deployments couldn't replicate. Cross stopped then, turning to look at Reyes with a stillness that was unsettling. He admitted he knew exactly what she was capable of, but he also knew her father. He had watched the man die because a shot was just 3 seconds and a few yards beyond human limits, and he had been powerless to change the outcome. He wasn't in a hurry to watch the same tragedy befall the man's daughter. Reyes met his gaze and noted with quiet respect that it might not be Cross's call to make. Neither Cross nor Eve slept that night. Eve lay on the cot in her Spartan 12x12 room, staring at the ceiling and running the numbers. 3,247 meters. At that distance, a 50 BMG round would be in flight for nearly 4 full seconds. In that window of time, the world could change. The wind could shift twice. The target could take a step. The very rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, would pull the bullet off course. The drop was staggering. The projectile would fall over 20 feet from its initial line of sight. Every variable, temperature, humidity, altitude, multiplied the margin of error until it was thinner than a human hair. She had never taken a shot past 1,400 meters in a controlled environment, and while she had pushed to 2,000 in the desert alone, this was a different beast entirely. She wondered if she was there because she was the best, or because 20 years of grief had finally found a target to strike. She looked at the Barrett case on the floor, silent and waiting. She thought about what Reyes had told her about Cross's hesitation. It made it harder to stay angry at him. Understanding his fear made him human, and a human obstacle was much harder to navigate than a cold, professional one. She thought about her father, not as the legendary specter the military worshipped, but as the man who burned toast and hummed country songs while cleaning his gear. She remembered the morning he left for the last time. She was only 8 years old, watching him crouched by the door in his uniform. He had taken her face in his hands and told her she was the best thing he ever made. At the time, she didn't realize it was a goodbye. She just thought he was being her dad. She pressed her face into her pillow, the memory a bittersweet ache, and finally drifted into a shallow sleep shortly after midnight. At 05:30, a knock on the door pulled her back to the present. She was already awake, her mind immediately snapping into mission mode. Cross entered, dressed in civilian clothes, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He sat down and offered a rare moment of vulnerability, admitting he owed her an explanation. He confessed that his resistance hadn't been about protecting the team, but about protecting himself. He recounted the ambush in Kunar in 2003, where Eve's father had saved his life by dropping 4 targets in 11 seconds. When the man didn't come home 2 years later and the person responsible vanished, Cross had carried that failure for 2 decades. Seeing Eve was like seeing a ghost demanding a debt be paid. Eve listened, her expression steady. She told him that his personal guilt wasn't a good enough reason to leave a high-value target in the field. Cross looked at her, and for the first time the resistance in his eyes vanished. He agreed. He told her they would insert in 48 hours and that she was to be fully integrated into every planning session. She wasn't support anymore, she was the primary. As he reached the door, she thanked him for the coffee. He almost smiled, a brief, complicated expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was a start. The following day was a grueling marathon of technical analysis. Eve sat through 6 planning sessions and 2 terrain briefings, diving deep into satellite imagery and Varez's security patterns. She surprised the intelligence analysts with the sharp, pointed nature of her questions. When she challenged their wind modeling, explaining how the ridgeline's altitude would cause the air to behave differently than their surface-level data suggested. The room went quiet. She explained that without mountain-specific meteorological data, the entire mission was built on a flawed foundation. Cross didn't hesitate. He ordered the analysts to get her exactly what she asked for. By the evening, the team's dynamic had shifted. They weren't warm, but they were direct. They treated her with the economy of language reserved for peers. Reyes was already fully on board, while a quiet operator named Tran began pointing out subtle terrain features she had missed, offering his help without needing to be asked. However, Senior Chief Garza remained the outlier. A veteran with nearly 2 decades of experience and a face like weathered stone, he watched her with a skeptical, calculating gaze. He didn't cause trouble, but he was clearly running the numbers on her reliability and coming up short. After the final briefing, Eve sought him out in the equipment room. She found him meticulously checking his kit, a task that clearly provided him with a sense of order. She asked him bluntly what it would take for him to trust her. Garza didn't sugarcoat his answer. He told her that trust was earned through time and shared blood, neither of which they had. But he admitted that her performance on the range was unlike anything he had seen in 19 years. He told her he didn't trust her yet, but he believed she might be exactly what she claimed to be. And for now, that was enough for him to do his job. Eve thanked him for his honesty, recognizing it as the most genuine interaction she'd had since arriving. As she left the room, she encountered Cross again. He asked about Garza, and she assured him they were fine. Cross seemed impressed, noting that for a man like Garza, fine was high praise. He then pivoted to a technical question, asking about her final shot on the range. He had noticed her wait 2 seconds before firing during a gust. Eve explained the exhale, a technique her father had taught her. She described feeling the pressure change on her cheek, a tactile sensation that signaled a momentary stillness on the trailing edge of a gust. Cross nodded slowly, acknowledging that her father had tried to teach many people that philosophy, but only a few truly understood it as a method. He told her father would be proud, but Eve corrected him. She wasn't doing this for his pride anymore. She was doing it for herself. Cross simply said good and told her to get some sleep. The final day before the mission was a blur of high-pressure preparation. They rehearsed the insertion sequence and walked through every possible contingency until the plans felt like muscle memory. Eve spent 3 hours building a mental wind model from the new mountain data, memorizing the ballistic solutions until she could recite them in her sleep. Cross joined her at the planning table, watching her work in silence. He asked her to talk him through the shot, and she did, every variable, every decision point. He remarked that her father used to do the same, building the shot in his mind before he ever touched the trigger. Eve admitted she had spent 10 years refining those lessons. Cross's acknowledgement that her father would be proud didn't sting this time. It felt like a weight finally settling into its proper place. At 18:00, the team assembled for the final gear check. 12 operators stood in the equipment bay, their weapon systems laid out with surgical precision. Eve stood at the end of the line, the Barrett case at her feet, dressed in the same rugged gear as the men. The looks of doubt were gone, replaced by the grim focus of a unit preparing for a strike. Cross walked the line, his eyes scanning every piece of kit, looking for the small oversight that could lead to a catastrophe. When he reached Eve, he searched her eyes for any sign of hesitation or hidden fear. He didn't find it. Instead, he saw a bone-deep clarity. It wasn't that she was fearless, but that she was possessed by a purpose stronger than her fear. It was a clarity built over a decade of solitary practice and the enduring memory of a man who had believed in her. Cross stepped back and addressed the group. He reminded them that the window for the target was narrow and would not reopen. Every roll was critical, and the objective was a clean execution and a clean extraction. He asked if there were any questions. There were none. He looked down the line, his gaze lingering on Eve for a fraction of a second before giving the order to finish it. The room erupted into motion. Reyes stepped up to Eve's shoulder, asking if she had eaten. When she mentioned she'd had lunch, he insisted it wasn't enough, jokingly threatening to tell her it was a direct order from the commander. Eve almost smiled, thanking him for his support after the range. Reyes simply shrugged it off, saying he had only told the truth. The final hours before the 0300 movement were spent in a kind of functional trance. Eve returned to her room to perform one last check of her personal gear. She checked the seals on her optics, the tension on the bipod, and the smoothness of the bolt action on the Barrett. Every movement was a ritual. She thought about the village in Kunar, visualizing the terrain she had memorized from the satellite maps. She saw the ridgeline, the steep drop-offs, and the specific angle of the roof where Varese was expected to appear. She wasn't just thinking about the shot. She was living it, experiencing the recoil and the sound of the suppressed report before it even happened. The darkness of the compound was absolute, save for the low hum of generators and the occasional flash of a red lens flashlight. At 02:45, the team gathered by the transport vehicles. The air was crisp, smelling of diesel and dust. There was no more talk, only the metallic clatter of gear being stowed and the low murmurs of final checks. Cross stood by the lead vehicle, a silhouette against the dim lights of the hangar. He looked at each of them, his presence a steadying force. This was the moment where the planning ended and the reality began. Eve felt the weight of the Barrett case in her hand, a solid, reassuring anchor. She looked up at the stars one last time, remembering her father's voice telling her to breathe with the world, not against it. As she climbed into the back of the transport, the shadows of the interior swallowing her, she felt a strange sense of peace. The ghost of her father was still there, but he wasn't a burden anymore. He was the foundation upon which she had built her own strength. The 3,247 meters ahead of her didn't feel like an impossible distance anymore. It felt like a destination she had been traveling toward her entire life. The engine roared to life, a deep vibration that shook the floorboards and signaled the start of the long journey into the heart of the mountains. The mission had begun, and for Evelyn Carter, there was no turning back. The path to Varese was paved with the math of the impossible and the memory of the fallen, and she was ready to walk every inch of it. The vehicles moved out of the gates, their headlights cut to black, navigating by infrared and the faint glow of the moon. The desert floor gave way to the rising foothills, the terrain becoming increasingly jagged and unforgiving. Inside the transport, the silence was absolute. These were men who had spent their lives in the dark, and they wore the silence like a second skin. Eve sat with her back against the metal hull, her eyes closed, feeling every bump and sway of the road. She was already calculating the atmospheric changes as they gained elevation. The air would grow thinner, the cold more biting. The density altitude would shift her point of impact. She adjusted the mental dials in her head, fine-tuning the solution. She thought about the exhale again. It wasn't just a trick for the range, it was a philosophy of existence. To wait for the world to pause, to find the sliver of stillness in the chaos, and to act only when the certainty was earned. She could feel the rhythm of the team around her, the steady breathing of Reyes, the watchful stillness of Tran, the heavy presence of Garza. They were a single organism now, a machine designed for a singular purpose. And she was the edge of the blade. As the transport climbed higher into the Hindu Kush, the world outside became a labyrinth of shadows and stone. The mission wasn't just about a target. It was about the closing of a circle that had been broken 20 years ago. The man responsible for her father's death was waiting in a valley at the end of the world, and she was bringing the storm with her. Every mile took them closer to the moment where the math would meet the man. The Barrett sat between her knees, a silent promise of what was to come. She wasn't her father, and she wasn't trying to be. She was the evolution of everything he had taught her, a precision instrument forged in the fire of his loss. The 03:00 start time came and went as they moved deeper into the hostile territory. The transition from the flat Arizona desert to the vertical world of Kunar was a psychological shift as much as a physical one. Here, the mountains didn't just exist. They loomed, ancient and indifferent to the small dramas of men. But Eve wasn't looking for mercy from the mountains. She only needed their stability, a place to set her bipod and wait for the exhale. The long night stretched on, the hum of the engine a constant companion as they drove toward the dawn and the final reckoning. In the darkness of the cabin, she caught Cross's eye. He was watching her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. There was no more tension between them, only the shared understanding of what lay ahead. They were both haunted by the same ghost, and they were both seeking the same resolution. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of final acceptance. She nodded back, a silent pact sealed in the cold air of the transport. They were going to finish this, not for glory or for the records, but for the man who wasn't there to see it. The mission was moving, the clock was ticking, and the distance was closing. 3,247 meters was all that remained between the past and the future. The journey continued through the winding passes, the air growing colder as the elevation surpassed 10,000 feet. Eve could feel the change in her lungs, the slight effort required to draw a full breath. It was a reminder of the physical toll the ridgeline would take. She would have to manage her heart rate, ensuring that the heavy thud of her pulse didn't disturb the delicate balance of the shot. Every heartbeat at 3 kilometers was a potential miss. She began a series of slow, rhythmic breathing exercises, calming her nervous system and centering her focus. She thought of her mother's white clapboard house, the smell of the pine trees in North Carolina, and the targets she had shot as a girl. Those targets had been the beginning of a journey she never could have imagined. Her father had seen something in her then, a steady hand and a quiet mind. He had nurtured it, not realizing he was sharpening a tool that would one day be used to avenge him. Or perhaps he had known. Perhaps every lesson, every country song, and every burned piece of toast was a way of preparing her for a world he knew he wouldn't always be there to navigate. The transport slowed as they approached the final drop-off point. The insertion would be on foot from here, a grueling climb to the ridgeline to avoid detection by Verez's patrols. The team began to stir, the silence replaced by the soft rustle of gear being adjusted. They stepped out into the biting mountain air, the stars above even more brilliant at this altitude. The ground was treacherous, a mix of loose scree and frozen earth. Cross signaled for the climb to begin. Eve shouldered the heavy Barrett case, the weight a familiar burden. She followed Reyes, who moved with a surprising grace for a man of his size. The climb was steep, a vertical struggle that demanded every ounce of their strength. They moved in a line, a chain of shadows ascending into the clouds. There was no room for error. A single misplaced foot could send a cascade of rocks down the slope, alerting the valley below. As they reached the crest of the ridgeline, the valley spread out beneath them, a dark bowl of shadows dotted with the faint lights of the village. Somewhere down there, Khalid Verez was sleeping, unaware that the daughter of the man he had killed was looking down at him from the heavens. Eve felt a surge of adrenaline, but she suppressed it instantly, forcing it back into the reservoir of her calm. She found her position, a narrow shelf of rock that offered a clear line of sight to the target building. She laid out the Barrett, the metal cold enough to sting her skin. She began the process of setting up the shot, her movements precise and economical. She checked the levels, adjusted the bipod, and cleared the path for the bolt. Tran moved into position beside her, his spotting scope already focused on the village. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a steadying anchor. Garza and the rest of the team took up security positions along the ridge, creating a perimeter of steel. Cross crouched nearby, his radio headset glowing with a faint green light. They were in position. Now they waited for the light. The pre-dawn hours were the coldest, the wind whispering through the rocks like a warning. Eve stayed behind the rifle, her eye pressed to the optic, watching the shadows shift as the sun began to hint at the horizon. The world was waking up and the window was opening. The village below began to emerge from the darkness. She saw figures moving between the buildings, security detail, the first signs of life. She adjusted the parallax on her scope, the image snapping into sharp relief. She could see the texture of the stone walls and the flutter of a prayer flag in the breeze. She began to feed the data into her mind. The angle of the sun, the drift of the smoke from a cooking fire, the slight shimmer of heat rising from the valley floor. 3,247 meters. The distance was a physical presence, a vast expanse of air and gravity that she had to conquer. She felt the Barrett against her shoulder, the weapon an extension of her own body. She was no longer just a woman with a rifle. She was the culmination of 20 years of waiting. The exhale was coming. The sun broke over the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with a harsh, golden light. And then she saw him. Khalid Verez stepped out onto the balcony of the target building, a tall figure in dark robes. He looked out over the valley, his posture arrogant and relaxed. He had no idea he was being watched from 3 kilometers away. Eve felt her finger migrate to the trigger, the cold steel a final point of contact. She breathed in the thin mountain air, feeling the pressure on her cheek. The wind was gusting, a chaotic swirl of air that threatened to tear the shot apart. She waited. She felt the team around her, their collective breath held in anticipation. She felt Cross watching her, his faith finally placed in her hands. She felt her father's presence in the rhythm of her heart. The wind began to taper, the pressure on her cheek softening. The exhale was here. She adjusted her hold for the Coriolis effect and the spindrift, her mind a calculator of lethal intent. She saw Varese turn slightly, presenting a perfect profile. The world narrowed to the center of the crosshairs. The 4-second flight time was a lifetime, but she had already lived it 1,000 times in her mind. She squeezed the trigger, not a pull, but a steady, deliberate pressure. The Barrett roared, a thunderous crack that echoed off the surrounding peaks. The recoil was a massive, familiar shove against her shoulder. And then the silence returned as the bullet began its long, lonely journey across the valley. For 4 seconds, time seemed to stop. The projectile arched through the thin air, a silver needle sewing the past to the present. Eve didn't move. She stayed behind the glass, her eyes locked on the target. She saw the impact before she heard it, a sudden, violent collapse of the figure on the balcony. Varese was gone, erased by a ghost from 20 years ago. The silence of the ridge was broken by the sharp, metallic sound of Eve cycling the bolt, the spent casing spinning into the dirt. The mission was over. The distance had been crossed. Don't make it weird. That was the last thing he had said to her, a brief, clipped instruction that felt more like a plea than a command. Eve watched him walk away, his silhouette blending into the shadows of the staging area, and for a moment she allowed herself to just exist in the silence he left behind. Then she reached down and gripped the handle of the Barrett case. She didn't need to look at it to know its contours. She felt the familiar, unforgiving weight of it pull at her shoulder. 42 pounds. It was a precise, mathematical constant in a world that felt increasingly fluid. It was the same weight it had always been, the same weight it had been when her father carried it across sun-scorched valleys she had only seen in grainy photographs. It was the same weight that had nearly toppled her as a teenager, when she had first tried to lift it in their backyard, her boots sliding in the grass as she staggered under the sheer mass of the weapon before finding her footing. She had her footing now. There was no staggering, no hesitation. She walked toward the transport with a gait that was steady and practiced, her spine straight against the burden. Outside, the Afghan night was an explosion of stars. A celestial map sprawled across a sky so clear it felt like you could reach up and touch the edge of the universe. But Eve didn't look up. Her gaze was fixed forward, her mind already miles away, navigating the terrain she had memorized from satellite imagery. She was already thinking about the ridge, about the way the wind would whistle through the jagged peaks, and about the 4 seconds of flight time that would define the rest of her life. 4 seconds. It was a brief window, a heartbeat in the grand scheme of things, but it was the window through which 20 years of a family's grief would travel at 2,800 feet per second. It was a journey toward a reckoning that had been decades in the making. She thought about her mother's parting words, a soft, urgent warning, don't try to be him. Eve adjusted the strap of the case. She wasn't trying to be him anymore. That phase of her life, the period of imitation and longing, had burned away like morning mist. She was just going to do the job, and then she was going to come home. That was the whole plan. It was simple, clean, and clinical. She loaded onto the transport, the metal ramp clanging under her boots. She found a seat, strapped in, and closed her eyes before the doors even hissed shut. The engine roared to life, a deep, vibrating hum that traveled through the floorboards and into her bones. They moved into the dark, leaving the flickering lights of the base behind. The transport flew for 4 hours and 20 minutes, a long, rhythmic transit through the void. When the wheels finally touched down, it wasn't on a paved runway, but in a valley so cold and dark it felt like the inside of something that had never known the touch of the sun. It was a place where the shadows seemed to have substance, a primal, ancient cold that seeped into the marrow. Eve stepped off the ramp, and the Afghan mountain air hit her face like a flat hand. It wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a physical, genuine impact, a blow delivered by the atmosphere itself. The temperature was 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was running hard across the valley floor, a restless, invisible force pulling at her gear and testing her balance. For a half second, she swayed, her center of gravity shifting before she planted her footing and adjusted. She had been cold before. She had trained in the freezing forests of the Pacific Northwest and the biting winds of the high desert, but there was a particular quality to the cold at this altitude. In a place where people were actively trying to kill you, the cold didn't just chill the skin, it sharpened the senses. It had a clarity to it, an honesty that stripped away everything non-essential. The mountain didn't care who she was or what she had survived. It didn't care about her lineage or how many thousands of rounds she had put through a target at a range in Arizona. The mountain simply existed, a massive, indifferent judge, and you either met it on its terms or you were consumed by it. Eve met it. She pulled her kit tight, cinching the straps until the gear felt like an extension of her own body. She lifted the Barrett case and fell into the patrol formation behind Tran without needing a single word of direction. They moved with the synchronized grace of a single organism. Cross was at the front, a ghost leading the way, with Garza bringing up the rear. 12 operators moving in a column through darkness so complete it felt like swimming in ink. The only navigation was the ghostly green glow of thermal optics on the point man, and the map burned into every person's memory from 6 grueling hours of briefing. Nobody spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen earth and the distant, lonely howl of the wind. For the first 40 minutes, the movement was straightforward. They traversed the valley floor, the ground firm and the grade manageable. Eve matched the pace without difficulty, her breathing deep and even. She possessed a specific kind of fitness, not the explosive, demonstrative strength of an athlete, but the quiet, functional endurance of someone who has spent years doing hard things alone. It was the strength of a long-distance runner combined with the stability of a mountain goat, a physical discipline that had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. Reyes, walking 2 positions ahead of her, glanced back once. In the absolute dark, she couldn't see the features of his face, but she could read the tilt of his head. He was checking on her, looking for signs of fatigue or hesitation. She gave a small, sharp nod, a silent signal of readiness. He turned forward again, satisfied. Then the grade changed. At 0200 hours, the team hit the base of the ridgeline. On the high-resolution satellite imagery in the climate-controlled briefing room, it had looked like a manageable slope. In reality, in the dead of night, carrying 42 pounds of rifle plus her personal kit, it was something significantly more demanding. It was a wall of rock and ice that seemed to stretch upward into the stars. Eve didn't complain. She didn't slow down. She put her head down and climbed 1 footfall at a time, focusing on the small circle of ground immediately in front of her. She felt the burn build in her thighs, a hot, searing sensation that eventually passed through the threshold of pain and into something colder and more permanent, a deep, rhythmic ache in the muscles. She acknowledged the sensation and then set it aside. Dwelling on it served nothing. The only way out was up. Halfway up the ascent, the man ahead of her, a quiet, efficient operator named Kowalski, slipped. His boot hit a patch of black ice, and he went down hard on one knee. The impact made a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo for miles in the stillness. Instantly, the entire column froze. Cross's hand went up, a silent command that was obeyed before it was even fully formed. For 30 seconds, they stayed perfectly still. 12 shadows merged with the rock, listening to the mountain. Nothing moved. There was no shout of alarm, no rustle of fabric from a hidden sentry. Cross's hand came down. They moved again. Eve passed Kowalski as he recovered. He caught her eye for a fleeting second, his expression one of frustrated embarrassment. She gave him nothing, no sympathy, no acknowledgement. In that environment, sympathy was a form of condescension. He didn't need a hand up, he needed to keep moving. He nodded slightly, and she moved on, her focus returning to the climb. They reached the crest of the ridgeline at 0347. The air up here was even thinner, each breath feeling like a hard-won victory. Cross pulled the team into a tight defensive perimeter, the operators fanning out to cover every approach. He crouched with Eve and Reyes over a ruggedized tablet, the screen's dim glow illuminating their faces. The satellite feed showed the target building as a cold, gray rectangle. "Target building is at your 11 o'clock, Cross whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Approximately 3 clicks. We confirmed Varese inside as of 2100 last night. No movement since. The intel suggests he's expected to appear on the exterior balcony between 0700 and 0800 for morning prayers. That's our window. 3 hours, Eve said, her voice steady. 2 hours, 53 minutes, Cross corrected. Alms, you need to be in position and settled before first light. That gives you approximately 90 minutes to prep the site. Eve checked the digital readouts on the tablet. Wind. Running northwest to southeast at the surface, Cross said. Mountain data suggests it'll shift at altitude near dawn. Your meteorologist flagged a possible crosswind rotation as the valley heats up. I saw the same thing in the data, she said, her mind already running the numbers. It'll shift left approximately 8 to 12 degrees starting around 0630. I've already built it into the solution. Cross looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. You built a shift correction into a shot you haven't taken yet? I built it in and I'll adjust in real time if the shift doesn't happen, she replied, her tone devoid of ego. But it'll happen. The thermal dynamics of this valley are predictable. He held her gaze, assessing the quiet confidence in her voice. Then Reyes goes with you as your spotter. Tran and Kowalski will provide close security. The rest of the team moves to a support position 400 meters east. If the shot goes clean, we extract via Route Bravo. If it goes loud, it won't go loud, Eve said. The silence that followed was heavy. Cross looked at her steadily, the look of a man who had seen too many perfect plans crumble. If it goes loud, he repeated, his voice firm, we extract via Route Alpha and we have the quick reaction force on a 30-minute string. Do you understand? Understood, she said. He held her gaze one more second. Carter, Commander, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, he said. You know the shot. Trust the shot. It was the most human thing he had said to her since the mission began. It wasn't a tactical instruction or a performance assessment. It was the thing you say to someone before they step into the breach, a brief bridge of empathy before the professional walls went back up. Eve picked up the Barrett case, the weight familiar and grounding. Copy that, she said, and began the final move toward the position. The hide site was a natural depression in the rock face, carved out by centuries of wind and ice. It sat approximately 60 meters below the ridgeline crest, a location identified by satellite imagery as the only spot offering a clean line of sight to the target while providing adequate concealment from the valley floor. Eve settled into the space with the careful, economic movements of someone who had spent years learning how to disappear into the environment. She didn't just sit, she merged with the rock. Reyes sat up beside her, his spotting scope already tripod-mounted and aimed. Tran and Kowalski vanished into the jagged shadows 20 meters back, their suppressed weapons covering the only viable approach route. Eve opened the Barrett case. The latch made a soft, oily click. She began to assemble the rifle in the darkness, her hands moving by feel alone. She had done this 1,000 times in a warm workshop, and 1,000 more in her backyard in North Carolina, often blindfolded. Her father had been a hard taskmaster on this point. He told her that a shooter who needs light to function has already accepted a limitation they shouldn't have to. Every component found its place with a mechanical certainty. The heavy barrel, the bolt assembly, the optics, every connection seated correctly. She cycled the bolt, a sound like a heavy door closing. It was clean and smooth. She loaded a single round, a cold bore shot, the most important shot of her life, and she was only loading one. One was all she would need. Reyes looked at her from across the spotting scope. Talk to me about the wind, he said softly. Northwest at the surface, 12 to 15 knots, she whispered back. At our elevation, it's running slightly lighter, call it 10. At target distance, I'm expecting a rotation starting in about 40 minutes. When it rotates, the crosswind component is going to increase. I'm holding for that, Reyes noted, and if it doesn't rotate, then I adjust back to the baseline and I'm still inside the solution, she said. The math doesn't lie. He nodded slowly, watching her work. You've done this before. It wasn't quite a question, more of an observation of her composure. Not at this distance, she admitted. But the physics don't change. Distance just makes everything that's already true more true. Every error is magnified, every tremor is expanded. Reyes was quiet for a moment, his eye pressed to the scope, peering into the darkness where the target building existed only as a shadow within a shadow. Your father ever talked to you about long shots? Philosophically? All the time, she said, her voice barely a breath. What did he say? Eve looked through her own scope. The target building appeared in the green thermal wash of the optics, a rectangular structure perched on a rugged hillside. The balcony was a dark, inviting notch on its face, 3,247 meters. It was an astronomical distance, a gap that seemed impossible to bridge with a piece of lead. But she could see it. That was enough. He said the distance doesn't matter, she said. He said a shot is a shot. The only thing that changes at distance is your relationship with time. You have more of it. The bullet is in the air longer, and most shooters can't handle that. They can't handle the waiting, the seconds between the trigger pull and the impact. They try to manage those seconds, but they can't because the bullet is already gone. You can't manage what's already happened. So what do? Reyes asked. You let it go, she said. You pull the trigger, and then you accept that it's done. The bullet either finds the mark or it doesn't, and there's nothing in those 4 seconds that you can do about it either way. Reyes was quiet for a long beat. That's either very zen or very terrifying, he murmured. A little bit of both, she said. The darkness held them in that specific, heavy quiet for the next hour and 40 minutes. Eve stayed behind the scope, but she didn't stare at the building constantly. She knew that sustained visual focus was a fast track to eye strain and degraded perception. Instead, she checked at intervals, reading the environment and feeling the wind on her face. She compared the physical sensation of the air against her skin to the visual data she saw through the scope. At 0515, Cross's voice crackled low in her earpiece. "How are you reading?" "Steady," she replied. "Wind hasn't rotated yet, but the pressure is dropping. We're on timeline, copy that," Cross said. "Verez's security detail has been rotating on a 40-minute cycle. Last rotation was 0500, next expected at 0540. Understood." At 0532, Ray's hissed movement, building entrance. Eve was already on the scope before he finished the word. Two armed men emerged from the building's ground-level entrance, their forms glowing bright in the thermal view. They walked the exterior perimeter, their movements brisk in the cold. "Security rotation is early by 8 minutes, Ray's whispered. "I saw it," Eve said. She tracked them with a detached interest, her breathing remaining slow and rhythmic. She didn't let the change in schedule spike her heart rate. She simply cataloged the information. The guards completed their circuit and disappeared back inside. "Early rotation," Ray's noted. "What does that mean?" "Could be routine variance," Eve said. "Could mean the internal schedule changed. Either way, it doesn't affect the window. He appears on the balcony for his prayers. That's a personal routine, not a security protocol. People like him rely on those routines to keep their sanity. You sure about that?" "No," she said simply. "But the intelligence is built on 6 weeks of pattern analysis, and the pattern has been consistent. I'm working with what we have." Cross came through the earpiece again. "Team is in position. You are clear to engage when the shot presents itself." "Confirm." "Confirmed," Eve said. And then they waited. The next 22 minutes were the longest of Eve's life. It wasn't because she was afraid of failing, or because she doubted her equipment, or the complex math of the solution. It was because waiting at the precipice of something irreversible has a weight all its own. No amount of training or mental conditioning can fully insulate a person from the gravity of the moment. She had prepared for the shot. She had spent years preparing for the trajectory and the terminal ballistics. But she hadn't fully prepared for the 22 minutes of silence before the shot, when the goal she had been chasing her entire adult life was close enough to touch. There was nothing to do but breathe and hold still and let the time pass over her. She thought about her father one last time. It wasn't a memory of him as a hero or a legend, but a small domestic image. Him sitting at the kitchen table, wearing reading glasses she had never seen him wear in public. There was a cup of coffee going cold beside him because he always forgot to drink it when he was focused on a task. She held onto that image for a second, then consciously let it go. She needed to be empty for what was coming. At 0641, the wind rotated. She felt it on her right cheek before Ray's could even call it out. It was a subtle shift in pressure, a change in the way the air moved through the rocks. The world was reorganizing itself around a new axis, exactly as the data had predicted. She made the adjustment in her hold without moving the rifle, a tiny internal recalibration. She updated the calculation in her mind and then released it, letting the knowledge live in her body rather than her thoughts. "Winds rotated," Ray said. "I know. You're already adjusted." "Yes." He looked at her across the spotting scope with an expression she couldn't see, but she felt the change in his energy. It was the particular quality of attention someone gives you when they have moved past believing in you and have started to trust you completely. At 0658, Cross's voice came through again, but the tone was different. It was tighter, more urgent. "Carter, we have a problem." Eve didn't move. She stayed glued to the scope. "Talk to me." "Thermal imaging on the building entrance just picked up 3 vehicles," Cross said. "Unknown personnel are unloading. The count is at least 8 additional armed individuals." "Security reinforcement," Ray's whispered. "Or something changed," Eve said. "Is the window still viable?" "Unknown," Cross replied. "Verez's position inside the building is currently unconfirmed." There was a pause, a brief moment of electronic static. "Carter, primary sniper, just came up on comms. Sergeant Walsh is out of surgery. He's saying the intel package has a secondary detail that wasn't in our initial briefing." Eve kept her eye on the crosshairs. "What detail?" "Verez knows there's a team in the area," Cross said, his voice flat. "He received a tip through a local network. Unconfirmed timing, but possibly as recently as 6 hours ago. The information hit the team like a physical current." Eve felt the tension ripple through the comms. He's going to move, Garza's voice came through, certain and grim. Not yet, Eve said, her voice cutting through the rising anxiety of the channel. If he was moving, he'd already be moving. Those vehicles could be the response to the tip, extra security to harden the site, not an evacuation. He thinks he's protected here, or it's a decoy, Cross suggested, and he's already gone. Thermal on the building, someone said. A pause followed. Still reading heat signatures in the upper level, consistent with prior readings. Could be him, could be the personnel he left behind. Eve took a deep, steadying breath. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. "Carter, 10 minutes is a long time in this scenario," Cross warned. "If he moves to evacuate, we abort and pursue the contingency plan," Eve argued. "But if he maintains his pattern, he appears on that balcony for morning prayers in the next 20 minutes, regardless of what he thinks he knows. Personal routines under stress don't change, they intensify. It's the one thing he can control right now." There was a long, agonizing pause from Cross. Then Garza spoke up. "She's right. Pattern behavior under threat is well documented. He'll pray, Cross sighed, 10 minutes. Then we reassess." Eve said nothing more. She stayed behind the scope, her world shrinking down to the size of a lens. She breathed at a rhythm of 6 seconds per cycle, 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. It was the way her father had taught her, the way the body finds its steadiest state without becoming rigid. She watched the balcony door, her mind a blank slate. At 0711, 13 minutes after the vehicles arrived and 7 minutes into the 10-minute window, the balcony door creaked open. "Contact," Reyes said, his voice level and professional. "Single male, balcony level, consistent with target description. Facing east." Eve saw him. At 3,247 meters, the man stood on the balcony in the early Afghan light. He faced east toward the rising sun that was just beginning to bleed over the horizon. He was a small figure in the distance, unaware that he was being watched by the daughter of a man he had ordered killed 2 decades ago. She acquired him in her reticle. Her breathing slowed even further. "Confirmed target," Cross said. "Confirming," Reyes added. He was running the facial recognition software on the spotting scope's digital overlay. 5 seconds. 10. Eve held her position. She could have taken the shot the moment he stepped out. She had the picture. She had the solution. Her finger was on the trigger, resting at the first wall of resistance. Her father had always told her that the trigger should feel your intent before you even feel the metal. But she waited for the final confirmation. "Confirmed," Reyes said. "It's him." "Cross," Eve said. "Confirmed target. I have the shot." A pause followed that lasted less than 2 seconds but felt like an eternity. "You are cleared hot," Cross said. She breathed in. She breathed out. In the stillness between the exhale and the next inhale, the natural pause where the body is at its most quiet, she broke the trigger. The Barrett fired. The sound was a thunderclap without a storm, an enormous, violent crack that was immediately swallowed by the vastness of the mountain. The recoil surged through Eve's body, a powerful kick she absorbed with her shoulder, keeping the rifle steady. She stayed in the scope and began the count. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the balcony, miles away, Khalid Varez suddenly collapsed backward. He didn't fall forward or slump, he was simply gone, vanished through the doorway as if pulled by an invisible wire. Reyes made a soft, involuntary sound, a sharp exhale of breath. It was the sound of a man who had just seen something that defied his understanding of what was possible. "Impact," he whispered. "Center mass. Target is down." Silence flooded the comms. Then Cross's voice came through, very quiet. "Confirmed kill." "Confirmed," Reyes said, his voice regaining its professional edge. "He's not getting up." Eve stayed behind the scope for 3 full seconds after the impact. She stared at the empty balcony doorway, at the space where a man had been and now was not. She had expected a surge of triumph, a violent relief, or perhaps a crushing sense of finality. But what she felt was quieter. It was the stillness of a room after a loud noise has finally ceased. She felt Reyes looking at her. She lifted her head and met his gaze. His face was a mask of complicated emotions. He was a veteran who had seen many things, and he was watching her navigate the aftermath of a world record shot with a quiet, observant respect. "New record," he said softly. 3,247 meters. That's a confirmed world record by over 100 meters. Eve didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. "Let's get off this mountain," she said. She began to break down the rifle with the same methodical precision she had used to assemble it. Through her earpiece, she heard Cross issuing extraction orders. The team was shifting from its static, watchful posture into a movement phase. She heard Garza calling the QRF to stand down. The mission was transitioning from execution to extraction, the well-oiled machinery of the unit clicking into its next gear. Then, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't coming through the headset. It was a sound from below the ridgeline, close and moving fast. Tran's voice came through sharp and low. Contact, multiple personnel on the eastern approach, 50 meters out. Eve's hands froze on the Barrett case for a fraction of a second. How many? Cross demanded. 6 armed, moving fast. The first shot rang out, a sharp report that echoed off the rock faces. Everyone move. Route Bravo now, Cross shouted. Route Bravo is compromised. Kowalski cut in, his voice tight. 2 vehicles are blocking the lower trail. They were already in position. Cross's voice didn't change pitch, but it became cold and incredibly precise. Route Alpha. All elements moved to Route Alpha now. The mountain, which had been holding its breath for 22 minutes, suddenly exhaled everything at once. Chaos erupted. Eve snapped the Barrett into its case in 11 seconds, a feat of speed she hadn't known she was capable of. She scrambled up, the case in her left hand and her sidearm in her right. She followed Reyes toward the extraction route as the sound of pursuing footsteps began to close the distance. She was no longer the elite sniper, the record holder, or the bringer of justice. She was just a person trying to get home. And as she ran, she knew the mountain didn't care about the difference. Route Alpha was a nightmare. It was 2 kilometers longer than their planned exit and required a 400-foot elevation gain before it finally dropped into the extraction valley. Every foot of that climb was going to be contested by people who knew these peaks far better than they did. Eve realized this within the first minute of the sprint. She ran behind Reyes, the weight of the Barrett case pulling at her arm, her breathing coming in ragged, desperate gasps. At this altitude, running felt like trying to sprint underwater. The air offered no substance, only a cold burn in the lungs. Behind them, the pursuit was relentless. It wasn't a matter of voices, it was the rhythmic clatter of gear and the crunch of boots on stone. 50 meters, maybe less. Reyes glanced back at her, his eyes wide with the intensity of the moment. She gave him a single, determined nod. "Still with you," she wheezed. Cross's voice was a steady anchor in her ear. "Reyes, Carter, Tran, Kowalski, you have pursued at your 6. Garza's element is 30 seconds ahead of you. Close the gap." Closing, Reyes grunted. He was an athlete of the highest order, but even he was feeling the strain of the ascent. Eve was pushing past her limits, parceling out her energy with the desperation of a drowning woman. At 0729, the first shot from the pursuers struck the rock face just inches from Eve's head. Stone chips sprayed her jacket, a stinging reminder of how close death was trailing. She didn't break stride. She couldn't afford the time it took to be afraid. Tran, moving with incredible fluidity, spun around and fired 3 controlled shots back down the trail without stopping his forward momentum. It was a masterclass in tactical retreat. 1 down. Tran yelled, 5 remaining. Kowalski, Cross commanded. Drop back and assist Tran. Buy them 40 seconds. On it. Kowalski shouted. Eve heard Kowalski peel off behind her, his weapon opening up in a rhythmic chatter. She kept her head down and kept running. Finally, Reyes reached the first major terrain feature of Route Alpha, a narrow, jagged passage between 2 vertical rock faces. It was a natural choke point. He stopped and pressed himself against the wall, waving Eve through. "Keep going," he shouted over the wind and the gunfire. "Don't stop until you reach the ledge." Eve didn't argue. She surged past him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The mountain was a gauntlet now, a trial of endurance and will. She could hear the fight raging behind her, the sharp cracks of the operator's weapons answering the chaotic fire of the pursuers. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the path, on the next step, on the promise of the valley beyond. She was going to make it. She had to. The mission was done, the debt was paid, and now the only thing that mattered was the return. Eve slipped through the narrow gap in the rock, her body slick with sweat despite the biting Afghan cold. The weight of the Barrett case was a constant, heavy reminder of the task she had just performed, a physical anchor dragging at her shoulder as she navigated the jagged terrain. Behind her, Reyes was a shadow, his movements efficient and lethal. He came through the opening just seconds after her, his eyes already scanning the horizon for the threats they knew were coming. He didn't hesitate, turning immediately to cover the mouth of the passage. His voice was a low, urgent rasp in her ear, commanding her to move. He gave her 30 seconds, a lifetime in their world, but a mere heartbeat in the context of the mountain. She didn't argue. She moved. The passage opened onto a wider ledge, a precarious shelf of stone that overlooked a dizzying drop. There, Garza waited. He was flanked by two other operators, their weapons raised and sweeping the approach angles with practiced precision. As Eve emerged, Garza performed the rapid assessment that only seasoned operators can manage. A single sweeping glance that cataloged her physical state, the integrity of her gear, and the look in her eyes. He asked if she was hit, and she felt the word no tumble out of her mouth before she even fully processed the question. She was intact, and more importantly, the weapon was intact. Garza grunted, a sound of grim approval. That Barrett was more than just a rifle now. It was evidence, a piece of a larger puzzle that Cross would never forgive them for losing. Garza turned to his men, ordering them to cover the passage until Reyes and Tran were through. The clock was ticking, and the mountain was unforgiving. 15 seconds later, Reyes appeared, moving at a controlled, rhythmic run that ate up the distance. 7 seconds after that, Tran and Kowalski burst through together. Kowalski's hand was clamped tightly against his left forearm, dark blood seeping through his fingers, but his pace didn't slacken. Eve called out his name, a question hanging in the air. Kowalski didn't stop, his voice steady as he told her it was a through-and-through shot. No bone hit, just meat and skin. He was moving, and that was all that mattered. Garza's eyes flicked to the wound for exactly 1 second, a clinical evaluation of survival. He told Kowalski they would tourniquet when they stopped. But until then, the only option was to run. Kowalski didn't plan on stopping anyway. What followed was a 14-minute ordeal that redefined Eve's understanding of physical and psychological limits. She had faced demands in her life, but nothing like Route Alpha. The slope was a punishing 40 degrees, a vertical wall of shale and grit that burned the lungs and turned the legs to lead. They traversed a ridgeline where the wind screamed at 30 miles an hour, a relentless force trying to shove them off the edge of the world. The footing was a lie, a treacherous mix of loose rock and hidden ice. Twice, Eve went down on one knee, the impact jarring her teeth, but she never lost her grip on the case. She scrambled back up, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps, and kept moving through a rock field that required as much climbing as it did running. Finally, they hit a long, descending spur that led toward the extraction valley, the gravity pulling at them as they plunged toward their only hope of escape. The pursuit was a ghost at their heels. Contact was intermittent, the occasional crack of a rifle or the glimpse of movement in the distance. Whoever was behind them was skilled, persistent, and hungry. The choke point at the passage had bought them time, and Tran and Kowalski's rearguard action had clearly made an impression, but the hunters hadn't given up. They were closing, and the gap was shrinking. At 07:44, the situation shifted from desperate to dire. Cross's voice crackled through the comms, cold and professional, but carrying the weight of bad news. The primary landing zone was hot. Enemy forces had positioned a vehicle across the lower valley road, effectively blocking the extraction bird. They couldn't land. Eve didn't stop running, her boots pounding the earth in a rhythmic cadence that mirrored her racing heart. Reyes didn't miss a beat either, redirecting them to the secondary LZ 2 kilometers to the east. 2 kilometers. In this terrain, with a bleeding man and lungs screaming for oxygen, it felt like an ocean. But Eve focused on the number. 2 was finite. 2 was manageable. It was the infinite things, the unknown variables, and the endless stretches of uncertainty that broke people. She could do 2. She adjusted her bearing, feeling Reyes' hand on her shoulder for a brief second. A silent gesture of solidarity. He remarked on her speed, a rare acknowledgement from a man who lived and breathed high-performance survival. At 07:51, they reached a flat section of terrain between 2 rising slopes. It was here that Cross's voice returned, and this time the tone was different. Cross didn't do panic, it wasn't in his DNA, but there was a tightness in his words, a razor-thin edge of urgency that made Eve's blood run cold. He told them to stop. The entire team froze in place, their breathing heavy and synchronized. Cross explained that the vehicle blocking the valley wasn't just a pickup truck. It was a mobile platform mounting a crew-served heavy machine gun. The silence that followed on the radio net was deafening. Reyes translated the reality for Eve, though she already knew. A heavy machine gun meant the extraction helicopter was a sitting duck. As long as that gun was manned, no one was going home. Garza immediately suggested taking out the technical, but Cross shut it down. The vehicle was tucked behind a natural rock berm, protected from small arms fire from the valley floor. To hit it, they would need something with more reach, something that could bypass the angle of the terrain. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but everyone on the net knew what he was thinking. Eve looked down at the Barrett case. The .50 caliber anti-material rifle was designed for exactly this kind of problem. It wasn't just a sniper rifle. It was a tool for dismantling machinery and overcoming fortified positions. She asked for the distance. The answer came back after a brief, pregnant pause, 1,100 meters. She would have a slightly elevated position, giving her a downward angle that bypassed the berm. The crew would be exposed from her vantage point. "I can take it," she said. Her voice was steady, a stark contrast to the thundering rhythm in her chest. Cross used her first name, a slip of the professional mask that revealed his concern. He reminded her of the toll the last 20 minutes had taken, the altitude, the weight, the heart rate. But Eve knew her limits, and more importantly, she knew how to push past them. She told him to set her up. Cross gave the order. Garza led her to a flat rock outcrop 40 meters to their left. It was a perfect perch, offering a clear sight line down into the valley where the technical sat like a predatory insect. Eve lay down behind the Barrett, her movements deliberate but hindered by the cold. Her hands were shaking, a fine motor tremor that was the body's natural response to sustained exertion and freezing temperatures. She opened the case and began to assemble the rifle. It took her 20 seconds, nearly double her best time, because her fingers were stiff and unresponsive. She didn't fight the cold. She acknowledged it, compensated for it, and moved on. Getting behind the scope, she found the target. At 1,100 meters, the technical looked small, but the threat it represented was massive. The berm was exactly as Cross had described, a solid wall of earth and stone that would have shielded the crew from anyone in the valley. But from her angle, she could see the gunner and his assistant. She could see the dust kicked up by their movements. She could also see the tremor in her own scope picture. Her heart was working too hard, sending rhythmic pulses through her body that translated into a slight, maddening bounce in the reticle. She needed to settle. She told Garza she needed 15 seconds. Garza understood. He didn't hover, he didn't offer empty encouragement. He simply turned and watched the approach route, giving her the space to do what she did best. Eve began the work of manual regulation. She breathed in for 4 seconds, then out for 6, using the exhale to trigger her parasympathetic nervous system. She was dragging her heart rate back down by sheer force of will. 10 seconds, 12. The world began to slow. The scope picture steadied, the bounce subsiding into a gentle, predictable sway. "I have it," she whispered. Behind her, she heard Cross alerting all elements to stand by. The movement of the entire team was now tethered to her trigger finger. She found the lead gunner in her crosshairs. She dialed in the elevation correction for the downward angle, her mind calculating the variables with the cold efficiency of a computer. The wind in the valley was different from the ridge, a swirling, unpredictable beast. She read it through the dust settling below and the frantic flapping of a piece of cloth tied to the vehicle's antenna. She built her solution, settled her weight, and found the pause between breaths. The Barrett kicked like a mule, the heavy recoil slamming into her shoulder. Because she was shooting from an imperfect, hurried position, the impact was jarring. For a terrifying half-second, she lost the sight picture, the world a blur of smoke and movement. She wasn't sure. She couldn't be sure. Then the silence of the valley was broken by the voice of the support element. The gun was down, the crew was down, the technical was disabled. "Move," Cross commanded. "Everyone move now." Eve was already on her feet, the adrenaline masking the pain in her shoulder. She broke down the rifle with frantic speed, stuffing the components back into the case. Garza grabbed her arm, his grip urgent and unyielding. This wasn't the time for precision or care. It was the time for raw, desperate speed. They ran. The extraction bird appeared like a vengeful spirit, coming in fast and low. The pilot was aggressive, tilting the rotors at a sharp angle as he flared for landing. He didn't want to be there any longer than necessary, and neither did they. The team scrambled into the belly of the aircraft in under 30 seconds. Kowalski was hoisted up by his teammates, his face pale but determined. Eve was the last one on, the Barrett case handed up to raise before she hauled herself into the vibrating interior. As the helicopter banked hard to the east, climbing away from the frozen valley, the Afghan mountains began to shrink beneath them. Eve slumped against the airframe, the case resting across her knees. Then came the crash. It started in her hands, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the bill coming due. Her body was accounting for every ounce of adrenaline, every spark of focus, and every jolt of fear she had suppressed. She pressed her palms flat against the hard plastic of the case, letting the tremors happen. Fighting them was a waste of energy she no longer possessed. Reyes sat down beside her, his presence a silent comfort. He asked if she was okay, focusing first on her physical state. She managed a nod, her voice a ghost of its former self. Reyes looked at his own hands, then back at her. He admitted he had never seen anyone make a shot like that second one, not under those conditions, not after a run like that. He asked her how she did it. Eve thought about it for a long time, watching the clouds drift past the open door. She told him the truth. She did it because she didn't have a choice. When the options are stripped away, you find out the difference between what you think you know and what you actually know. Reyes nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. Across the cramped cabin, the team's medic, Patel, was working on Kowalski. Patel was a man of few words, a compact and intense professional who spoke in a low, focused shorthand as he cleaned and dressed the wound. Kowalski was staring at the ceiling, caught in that strange limbo between the throbbing pain of the injury and the overwhelming relief of survival. He caught Eve's eye and offered a simple two-word tribute, "Good shooting." Eve offered a two-word reply of her own, "Good running." A small, tired smile touched Kowalski's lips before he closed his eyes. Cross was at the front of the helicopter, huddled with the pilots. Eve watched the set of his shoulders, the way he remained upright and stable even as the aircraft buffeted through the mountain air. He was a man who had found his footing in a world of constant instability. She remembered what he had told her before the mission. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Trust the shot. She had trusted it. Twice now, she had bet everything on a single pull of the trigger, and twice the world had shifted in her favor. She closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the engine hum through her bones. The silence was broken when Cross made his way back through the aircraft and sat down across from her. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke a single number, 9. Eve didn't understand at first. He clarified. During the extraction, there were 9 confirmed engagements. Eve had accounted for 4 of them, the 2 on the road and the 2-man crew of the technical. He asked if she understood what he was telling her. She did. She had known the reality of her choice when she signed up. She had sat in the desert, staring at her father's rifle, trying to reconcile the mechanics of ballistics with the finality of death. But the intellectual understanding was a feather compared to the weight of the truth. 4 lives. In the span of 14 minutes, she had ended 4 lives to save 12 others. It was necessary. It was professional. It was correct. And yet it sat in her chest like a cold, jagged stone. She told Cross she understood. He asked how she was processing it. She was honest. She was still in the stage where she was simply glad they were all alive. Cross told her that part would last for a while. Then the other part would come. And when it did, she promised him she would deal with it. The conversation turned to her father. Cross spoke of him with a quiet reverence, recalling how her father had come to his office after his first combat deployment, not to talk, but just to sit with someone who knew the weight. He told Eve his door was always open. It was a gesture that meant more than he could likely imagine. As he stood to leave, Eve called out his name. She pointed out that he had called her Eve on the comms before the second shot. Cross paused, the engine noise filling the gap between them. He admitted he had. When she asked why, he told her it was because she wasn't a variable anymore. She was a person he was responsible for. As the helicopter continued its eastward journey, the sky began to transition from the sharp, cold blue of the high altitudes to a warmer, wider hue. The team settled into the peculiar, exhausted quiet that follows a successful mission. Reyes fell asleep against the airframe, a man who knew how to steal rest whenever the world allowed it. Garza was cleaning his weapon, the rhythmic clicking of the parts a meditative ritual. Tran was writing in a small notebook, his expression focused and private. Kowalski was out too, his bandaged arm cradled against his chest. Eve looked at them all, the men who had doubted her 4 days ago. She had entered their world as an intruder, a civilian contractor with a legacy she hadn't earned. But in 36 hours of operational reality, she had become something else. She knew the cadence of their voices on the radio. She knew how they moved under fire. She had realized with a start that she felt responsible for them. Their safety was a weight she carried as personally as the Barrett. She realized then that she hadn't made that 1,100-meter shot to prove a point or to honor her father's ghost. She had made it because they needed her to. That was her story, not his. The descent toward the forward operating base began. The landscape shifted, the frozen peaks giving way to the lower, dustier country. There would be debriefings, medical checks, and a call to General Hale. There would be the long flight back across the ocean. But for now, there was only the quiet space between what had happened and what came next. Eve sat with her father's rifle and the knowledge of what she had become. She felt the weight of it all, and she didn't flinch. Feeling the weight was what kept you human. It was the people who stopped feeling it that you had to worry about. The wheels hit the tarmac of the FOB with a jarring thud. The ramp dropped and the familiar, dusty air of the base rushed in. Garza was the first out, followed by the rest of the team. Eve stood, the Barrett case heavy in her hand, and walked down the ramp into the gray Afghan morning. The mission was over, but the shift in her soul was permanent. The debriefing was a grueling 6-hour marathon. She sat in a sterile, gray room while intelligence officers and analysts picked apart every second of the engagement. They wanted the wind speeds, the sight pictures, the minute details of the 4 seconds between the trigger pull and the impact. She gave it to them in the flat, factual language they required. She was precise, chronological, and utterly detached. At the 4-hour mark, a young analyst slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was the ballistic confirmation. Using laser-range data and GPS coordinates, they had verified the distance of her first shot. 3,247 meters, a new world record. The previous record had been 3,149. She had cleared it by nearly 100 meters. She pushed the paper back. She told the analyst she knew. He seemed stunned by her lack of reaction, reminding her that it was a world record. She simply asked him what the next question was. The record didn't change the weight in her chest. It didn't change the 4 lives she had taken or the 12 she had saved. It was just a number. Cross remained in the room for the final 2 hours, a silent observer against the wall. When it was finally over and the general had offered a stiff, formal handshake, Cross fell into step with her in the hallway. He asked her the only question that mattered. How was she? She told him she was tired. He liked that answer. He told her the record would be classified along with the mission. Her name wouldn't be in the news. Eve told him she didn't need it to be. She wasn't most people. As they reached the door leading out into the base, Cross mentioned that General Hale was flying in the next morning to see her. Eve had expected as much. Then Cross relayed a message from Reyes. Apparently, Reyes had declared that if Eve ate dinner alone that night, he would take it as a personal insult, and he had a very long memory. Eve laughed. It was a genuine, bright sound that felt out of place in the grim environment of the FOB. She told Cross to tell Reyes she'd be there. Dinner was a chaotic, loud affair in the mess hall. It was aggressively normal, which made it the perfect antidote to the mountain. 12 operators and 1 civilian contractor crowded around a set of pushed-together tables. Reyes had sourced the best food the base had to offer, which wasn't saying much, but the effort was there. The conversation was a whirlwind of dark humor and shared history. Kowalski was eating left-handed, refusing to let his injury slow him down. Tran was in the middle of a long, convoluted story about a previous mission involving a goat and a satellite phone. Eve sat among them, listening to the laughter and the banter, and realized she was no longer an outsider. She was part of the fabric of the team. She looked at the men around her and knew that the weight she carried was one they all shared. And in that shared burden, she found a way to move forward. The things that seem most unlikely in this world usually are the ones that carry the most weight when they finally manifest. In the mess hall of the forward operating base, the air was thick with the scent of industrial cleaner, stale coffee, and the lingering heat of a desert day that refused to fully retreat. Garza sat at the far end of the long, battered table, eating with his usual economy of motion. There was something fascinating about the way he moved. He didn't waste a single calorie or a second of time. It was the same precision he brought to a rifle, translated into the simple act of consuming a meal. At some point, amidst the low murmur of other teams and the distant hum of a generator, he caught Eve's eye across the table. He didn't smile, but he gave her a single, deliberate nod. It wasn't a small, polite twitch of the chin. It was a real nod, the kind that meant something specific coming from a man who used gestures the way other people used long, winding paragraphs. It was a silent induction into a fraternity she had spent her whole life trying to understand. She nodded back, feeling a strange, grounding sense of belonging settle in her chest. Cross sat at the middle of the table, his presence a steady anchor in the room. He ate slowly, listening more than he talked, which Eve was beginning to realize was his natural mode in any environment that wasn't a formal briefing. In the field, he was a font of directives and data. But here, in the shadows of the evening, he had a quality of attention that made people feel heard without him having to utter a single word. Watching him operate in an informal context gave her a completely different picture of the man than the one she had painstakingly built during those first 2 high-tension days. The man who had looked at her in the briefing room with cold, clinical eyes and said, "I asked for a sniper, not a gunsmith," was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But so was this man, the one who had brought her coffee at 05:30 when the world was still gray and silent, the one who called her Eve when she was 50 meters from an enemy technical, and needed to be reminded that she was a human being and not just a variable in a ballistic equation. After dinner, as the clatter of trays signaled the end of the meal, Reyes appeared at her shoulder like a ghost. "Walk," he said. It wasn't a question, nor was it a suggestion. It was a directive wrapped in a quiet, gravelly tone. They stepped out of the humid mess hall and into the biting chill of the desert night. They walked the perimeter of the FOB in the dark, their hands shoved deep into their jacket pockets, their breath blooming into small, disappearing clouds in the cold air. The base was a landscape of silhouettes, the outlines of HESCO barriers, the skeletal frames of communications towers, and the distant, rhythmic sweep of a searchlight. "How are you actually doing?" Reyes asked after they had covered a few hundred yards in silence. It wasn't a casual inquiry. He was looking for the truth, the kind that people usually hide behind bravado. "I keep thinking about the 4, she said. She didn't have to specify who or what she meant. Reyes was someone she had decided to be honest with, and she didn't see any reason to change that now. The memory of the 4 men she had taken down was a sharp, clear image in her mind, etched there by the clarity of her high-powered optics. "Yeah," Reyes said, his voice low and steady. "I know why it was necessary. I know I'd do it the same way again if the clock reset. I know all the logical things about it, all the tactical justifications, but it's not a logical feeling, is it?" "No," Eve admitted. The weight of it wasn't about guilt, exactly. It was more about the shift in her own reality. Reyes walked for a long moment, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. "The first time I had to engage up close. Not a long shot, but right there, close enough to see the color of their eyes. I didn't sleep for 4 days. Not because I thought I was wrong, not because I felt like a monster. It was because I really understood for the first time that I had the capacity to do it. And that capacity doesn't go away once you've acknowledged it." He paused, stopping to look out over the dark expanse beyond the wire. "It's part of you now. You learn to carry it right or you don't, but either way it's there, sitting in the back of your mind like a tool you never knew you owned." Eve absorbed that, letting the cold air fill her lungs. "Does it get easier?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Easier is the wrong word," Reyes said, turning to look at her. "You just get better at carrying the weight. You understand the geometry of it better. It stops surprising you, which sounds terrible when you say it out loud, but it actually makes the whole thing more manageable. You stop fighting the fact that it's part of you." He studied her face for a beat. "You're going to be fine, Carter. I don't say that to a lot of people. Most people break or they turn into something else. You're just becoming more of who you already were." "Thank you, Reyes. Don't make it weird," he said automatically, his gruff exterior snapping back into place like a spring-loaded trap. Eve laughed. It was the second time she had laughed in one evening, and the sound felt foreign yet vital in the stillness of the base. She was apparently not done laughing, which felt like a piece of important information she needed to file away. They walked back toward the barracks in a companionable quiet, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have seen the worst parts of the world and decided to keep moving anyway. She thought about how 4 days ago she hadn't even known this man's name, and now she felt the weight of his opinion with a physical intensity. It was the weight of being seen clearly and still being judged as someone worth knowing. The next morning, the atmosphere of the base shifted. General Hale arrived at 09:00 sharp. He looked older than he had in the dusty workshop in Arizona, or perhaps it was simply that Eve was looking at him through eyes that had seen more in the last few days than in the previous 10 years. He was carrying a simple leather briefcase, and surprisingly, he was alone. There was no aide-de-camp, no security detail, no second set of footsteps echoing behind him. When he walked into the small, cramped meeting room where Cross and Eve were waiting, he set the briefcase on the scarred wooden table and looked at both of them for a long, silent moment before taking a seat. "The mission was a complete success," Hale said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who dealt in certainties. Khalid Velez has been confirmed dead by 2 independent intelligence sources as of 04:00 this morning. His network is already fracturing. 2 of his senior lieutenants have reportedly gone to ground, and one has already been attempting to contact coalition forces to negotiate a surrender. He paused, his gaze dropping to the table for a split second before returning to them. 20 years, it's done. Eve sat with those words, asterisk it's done. Asterisk 2 words to encapsulate 2 decades of shadows. She thought of her mother in their quiet kitchen in North Carolina, the way she had looked at the Marine captain in his dress uniform all those years ago. She thought of the little girl she had been, a girl who hadn't understood that a final goodbye meant forever. The ghost of her father, which had haunted the peripheries of her life, suddenly felt less like a specter and more like a memory. It's done, but there will be no public record, Hale continued, his tone turning professional. The operation remains classified at the highest level. Your participation will be documented internally, but it will not appear in any accessible personnel file or public record. To the world, Velez simply ceased to exist. He looked specifically at Eve. That means no official credit, no public acknowledgement. The record stands for the eyes of the few, but it cannot be claimed openly. You will never receive a medal for this, Eve. I understand, she said, her voice steady. I didn't come here for credit, General. I didn't do this for a medal. Hale studied her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of resentment or hesitation. Then he nodded once with the particular gravity of a man who has spent a lifetime learning to read people and has just confirmed something he had long suspected. There's one more thing, he said. He reached for the briefcase and clicked the latches open. He reached inside and drew out a sealed envelope, setting it on the table in front of her. The envelope was old. The paper had that distinct, tactile quality of something that had been stored with extreme care for a long time, not deteriorating, but carrying the texture of time itself. It was slightly yellowed at the edges, the adhesive on the flap looking brittle. On the front, her name was written in a handwriting she recognized instantly. It was a script she had seen on birthday cards and old letters tucked away in shoe boxes. Her whole body went still, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Your father wrote that letter before his final deployment, Hale said quietly, his voice softening. He gave it to me with very specific instructions. I was to deliver it if and only if a specific set of circumstances occurred. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. He wrote that I should give it to you if you ever found yourself in the same room with the man responsible for his death. He knew the path you were on, even then. Eve looked at the envelope, her vision blurring for a second. He planned for this, she whispered. He hoped it would never be necessary, Hale corrected. He hoped you'd live your whole life and never be called to this kind of work. But he knew you, Eve. He knew your mind, your focus, your refusal to back down. He knew you better than you knew yourself at that age. And he wanted to make sure that if this moment ever came, he had a chance to speak to you through the middle of it. Cross stood up quietly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. I'll give you the room, he said, his voice respectful. No, Eve said immediately. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. Stay. Cross hesitated, then sat back down, his presence a silent support. Eve looked at the envelope for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she picked it up. The paper felt cool and slightly textured under her fingertips. She slid a thumb under the flap, the old glue giving way with a dry, papery snap. Inside were 2 pages, covered in her father's handwriting. The handwriting she had grown up seeing on sticky notes on the refrigerator, and that one long letter he'd sent her when she was 12. The one she'd read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. She read it. She read it once quickly, the way one reads when the brain is desperate for information, needing to know what the words were before it could even begin to process what they meant. Then, she took a breath and read it again, slowly this time. Cross and Hale sat in a profound silence, letting her move through the pages at her own pace. When she finished the second reading, she set the letter face down on the table and stared at the blank wall for a moment, her mind a whirlwind of images and emotions. What does it say? Cross asked. His voice was so quiet it was almost part of the silence. She picked it up and looked at the familiar loops of the ink. He says he's sorry, she began, her voice remarkably clear. He's sorry for leaving, for all the years I spent without him. He says he made choices that he knew had costs, but he realized too late that he wasn't the one paying them. We were. She paused, swallowing hard. He says he never wanted this life for me. He says he wanted me to be a teacher or an architect, Anything that meant I would come home every single day to the same place, to the same people. But he also admitted that he knew what he had given me. He knew he'd passed on the ability to do exactly what he did, and he realized those two truths couldn't both be entirely right. So he sat with that contradiction and decided the best he could do was make sure I was ready if the world ever forced me to choose. She paused again, her finger tracing the edge of the paper. Hale and Cross waited, neither of them daring to breathe. And then he says, she stopped, her voice catching for just a second before she regained her composure. He says the rifle is never the weapon. She looked up at them, her eyes bright. He says the rifle is just metal and machine parts. It does exactly what the laws of physics tell it to do, nothing more and nothing less. He says the real weapon is the person behind it. The judgment, the restraint, the knowledge of when asterisk, not asterisk, to pull the trigger. He says the best snipers he ever knew weren't the ones who could make the longest shots or hit the smallest targets. They were the ones who knew which shots were unnecessary. They were the ones who understood the gravity of the space between the finger and the trigger. The room was silent. A distant jet roared over the base, but inside the four walls, time seemed to have stopped. He says he hopes I understand the difference, she said, and he says if Hale is giving me this letter, then I probably already do. She set the letter down again, her hands finally still. Hale's eyes were wet, a rare crack in the armor of a general. He was looking at the table, making no attempt to hide his emotion, which told Eve more about the man's character than any service record ever could. He was old enough and experienced enough to have stopped performing stoicism for its own sake. Cross was looking at her with an expression she had seen only once before, back on the range in Arizona when he had touched the stock of her father's rifle and let a flicker of grief cross his face. It was the look of a man who finally saw a long-standing debt being paid. He was a great man, Hale said quietly. He was a pretty good dad, Eve replied. She folded the letter with meticulous care and put it back in the envelope. She tucked it into the inside pocket of her jacket, right against her chest. It settled there with a weight that was both heavier and lighter than she had expected, a burden and a blessing all at once. She looked at Cross. He looked back at her, a silent understanding passing between them. They didn't need words to bridge the gap anymore. Hale cleared his throat and opened his briefcase again, and for the next hour, the meeting turned to logistics, operational debriefs, and the mundane details of her return stateside. Eve was grateful for it. She needed something concrete to hold onto while the larger, more tectonic shifts of her life settled into their new, permanent places. She flew home 4 days later. She didn't head back to the dry heat of Arizona. She went home to North Carolina. The air was thick with the scent of pine and humidity as she drove the rental car down the familiar winding roads. When she pulled into the driveway of the white clapboard house, her mother was already standing on the porch. Diane didn't wait for the car to fully stop. She came down the steps at a pace that wasn't quite a run, but contained all the emotional velocity of one. When Eve stepped out, her mother took her face in both hands, the gesture an exact mirror of how her father had held her on the morning he left for the last time. "You came home," Diane said, her voice trembling. "I said I would, Mom," Eve replied. Her mother held her face for a long, searching moment, looking at her the way only a mother can, checking for the changes that couldn't be seen, the internal rearrangements of the soul, the new weights, and the new understandings that a child brings back from the world. "Are you okay?" Diane asked. "Not entirely," Eve said honestly, "but I will be." Diane nodded slowly, her eyes brimming. "He would have." "I know, Mom," Eve said gently, cutting off the sentence before the grief could take hold. Her mother pulled her into a hug that lasted a long time. Eve let it last, standing on the porch of the house she had grown up in, feeling a particular quality of being home that was almost painful in its familiarity. It was the way familiar things become unbearably precious when you've been close enough to losing them to understand what their absence would truly mean. She gave her mother the letter that evening. Diane read it at the kitchen table while Eve sat on the back porch in the deepening shadows. She looked out at the backyard where the paper target post still stood, weathered and gray. It was bare now, standing like a monument to a purpose that had been fulfilled. It was something that had outlived its original use but remained standing because it meant something just by existing. When Diane came to the back door, her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steady, reinforced by a new kind of peace. "He knew you so well," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "He knew us both," Eve replied. Diane sat down beside her on the porch steps, and they sat together in the dark for a long time. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. They had learned that some silences are more communicative than words, capable of holding the vast, complex history of a family that had finally found its way back to a quiet center. 3 weeks later, Eve found herself driving back to Arizona. But she wasn't going back to the small, private workshop where she had rebuilt her father's rifle. She had been offered something else. The call had come from Cross, which had surprised her for a few seconds before it made perfect sense. She was learning that Cross operated by moving toward what was true rather than what was comfortable, and the truth of their operation had made one thing very clear. "There's a program," he had told her over the phone, his voice as steady as ever. "Special Operations Sniper Instruction, Advanced Level. They need someone who can teach long-range precision at a level most instructors can't even conceptualize. Someone who can teach the physics, the mechanics, and most importantly, the psychology of the shot. They need someone who understands it from the inside out." There had been a pause on the line. "Hale recommended you. I seconded it." "You seconded it?" she had asked, a hint of a smile in her voice. "Even though a month ago you told me I didn't belong in your briefing room?" "I was wrong," he had said simply. "I try not to compound errors by refusing to correct them." She had been quiet for a moment, looking out at the North Carolina trees. "What does the job involve?" "Training the next generation," Cross had explained. "Sniper schools, advanced marksmanship programs, specialized unit training. You'll be writing curriculum, running ranges, and working with some of the best shooters in the military to make them better." And, he added, his tone shifting slightly, "occasionally being attached to operational units who need someone with your specific, unique capabilities." She had said yes. So she drove back to Arizona, but this time she headed toward a different compound, a larger, more imposing facility with sprawling ranges and a constant, purposeful energy. She walked through the front gate with the Barrett case slung over her shoulder, the weight of it familiar and balanced. She found the range where her first class was scheduled, set up her equipment, and waited. They arrived at 0700. 12 students, a mix of Army Rangers, Marine Scout snipers, 2 Air Force TAC personnel, and a Navy SEAL whose reputation preceded him. All of them were experienced. Most of them were decorated. And all of them, she could see immediately, were running the same internal assessment on her that she had once run on them. It was that rapid, unconscious calibration that happens in professional environments when a new element is introduced. She could see the questions forming behind their polite, disciplined faces. Asterisk, who is she? Why is she here? What does a civilian woman know about the art of the long shot? Asterisk, she recognized the skepticism. She didn't fight it, she let them look. Then she walked to the front of the range and stood before them, her presence commanding despite her lack of a uniform. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she began, her voice carrying easily across the open space. "Most of you have been told I hold a confirmed record at 3,247 meters. Some of you looked that up and found absolutely nothing because the operation is classified. Some of you are sitting there wondering if it's even real." She looked down the row of faces, meeting every eye. "It is real, but we aren't here to talk about that shot. We're here to talk about the shots you haven't taken yet and how to make sure you're ready for them when they arrive." She paused, letting the silence build. "The rifle is never your real weapon. Your mind is. That's what we're here to train. If you think this is just about ballistics and windage, you're in the wrong place." A hand went up. It was a Marine Scout sniper, a man in his mid-30s named Ortega. He had the lean, hungry look of someone who had spent years in the dirt, evaluating everything against a carefully maintained internal standard. "Instructor Carter," he said, the title given with a touch of skepticism. "What can you teach us that we haven't already been taught by the best schools in the world?" Eve looked at him, unfazed. "The difference between a shot you made and a shot you understood," she said. "Most shooters can make the shot if the conditions are right. Very few can tell me exactly why it worked when the conditions are wrong. And if you can't tell me why it worked, you can't reproduce it under stress in terrain you've never seen in conditions that are nothing like the range." She leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell me exactly why your last successful long shot worked, Ortega? Not the math, the feel." The Marine was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed. "Good," Eve said. "That's where we start." The months that followed were some of the most demanding of her professional life, but they were also unexpectedly satisfying. Teaching was different from doing. It was harder in some ways because it required her to unpack things she had always known intuitively. She had to rebuild her knowledge into a language that could be transferred to someone else, and in that process, She discovered things about her own skill that she hadn't realized she knew. Her students were resistant at first. It was the natural friction of experienced people being told there was a better way to do things they had already mastered. She was patient with that friction. She understood it because she had lived it, and because her father had been patient with her in the exact same way. Ortega was the last one to fully come around. He was the most experienced and had the most invested in his existing methods. The moment she finally won him over was unremarkable from the outside. It was a simple afternoon on the range when he had been struggling with a shot at 1,400 meters. He had missed by 6 inches to the right in 3 previous attempts, despite correcting for the wind. When he finally hit the steel, he turned to her with an expression that wasn't quite surprise, but was something adjacent to it, the look of a man who had finally felt a piece of a puzzle click into place. "That's the exhale," Eve said, standing behind him. He looked up at her, confused. "What?" "The pause between the exhale and the next inhale," she explained. "You were firing on the tail end of the exhale, not in the true pause. At this distance, the difference is about a 1/4 inch of muzzle movement caused by the last bit of lung contraction. At 1,400 meters, that 1/4 inch is exactly the 6 inches you were missing by." Ortega looked at his rifle, then at the distant target, then back at her. "Your father teach you that?" "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, a new level of respect in his eyes. "I heard about him, Spectre. He was legendary in the community." "He was a good dad," Eve said. She said it simply, without the complicated weight it had once carried. The simplicity of the statement surprised her, and she stood with that feeling for a moment, realizing that the old tangles had finally been laid flat and smooth. He was her father. He had taught her everything, and she had taken that foundation and built something that was entirely her own. That was the best tribute she could ever offer him. She went home that evening and called her mother. They talked for an hour about nothing in particular, the garden, the neighbors, a movie Diane had seen. It was the most comfortable conversation they had had in 20 years because there was nothing left unsaid between them. The secrets were gone, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. 6 months after the operation, Cross called her again. "New mission," he said without preamble. "Different country, different target, we need a primary." Eve was quiet for a moment, looking out at the Arizona sunset. "Who's the team?" "Most of the same people," Cross said. "Reyes, Garza, a few new additions, and me." "And you're the lead?" "Yes," he said. She thought about her father's letter. She thought about the shots not taken and the judgment that mattered more than the skill. "When do I need to decide?" "End of the week," Cross replied. She thought about Ortega and his 1,400-meter shot. She thought about her 12 students who were slowly becoming more than just shooters. They were becoming thinkers. She thought about her mother back in North Carolina and the weathered post in the backyard. Finally, she thought about Cross's voice on that mountain in the dark. "Asterisk, you are cleared hot." Asterisk, and she remembered the way he had said her name before those words. "I'm in," she said. "Good," Cross said, and she could hear the relief he was trying to hide. "One condition," Eve added. "What?" "I'm not support. I'm primary from the start. No qualification tests, no proving myself again. You call me because you already know who I am." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Already planned it that way," Cross said. 3 weeks later, Eve stood on a high, jagged ridge in a country she had never visited. The weather was a biting, swirling mix of sleet and wind. The Barrett was assembled in front of her, its barrel pointing out over a valley that was a chaotic mess of shifting intel and moving targets. Cross was 3 feet to her right, both of them observing a battlefield that was changing faster than the original plan could account for. Variables were cropping up that hadn't been there an hour ago. Decisions needed to be made before the full picture was clear. Cross turned his head to look at her, his eyes shielded by tactical goggles. "Your call, Eve," he said. She looked through the scope. She felt the wind shift against her right cheek. She read the subtle movements of figures in the distance, calculating distances, angles, and the myriad probabilities of human behavior. She thought about the mission, the safety of the team, and the things she couldn't see. Most of all, she thought about her father's last words to her. "Asterisk, you're the best thing I ever made, Evie. Don't let anyone tell you different." Asterisk, and she thought of the letter. Asterisk, the weapon is the person behind it. The restraint. The knowledge of when not to pull the trigger. Asterisk, she lowered the scope, her finger moving away from the trigger guard. "We wait," she said. Cross didn't question her. "The southern approach," she explained, her voice calm. "Give it 4 minutes. The variable on the left flank will resolve itself, and we'll have a cleaner picture and a much safer extraction route. 4 minutes costs us a little time, but it buys us everything else." Cross held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, searching for any doubt. Finding none, he keyed his radio. All elements stand by. Hold position for 4 minutes. Eve looked back at the battlefield. She felt a profound sense of focus. She was finally entirely at peace with who she was and what she was doing. She wasn't her father's shadow. She wasn't a legacy chasing itself through a life that didn't fit. She wasn't a daughter defined by grief. She was Evelyn Carter, the best long-range shooter alive, a teacher, a teammate, and a woman who had finally set down the weight of trying to be someone else so she could pick up the manageable weight of being herself. 4 minutes passed. The southern approach opened up exactly as she had predicted, the tactical situation clarifying like a lens coming into focus. Cross looked at her one last time. "Still your call." She raised the scope. She found the target. She breathed in, feeling the air fill her lungs, and then she let it out, finding that perfect, silent stillness in the gap between breaths. In that moment, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She hadn't been put there by her father, and she wasn't there because of 20 years of mourning. She was there because she had walked through every hard thing the world had thrown at her and hadn't looked away. Asterisk true legends. Asterisk Gabriel Carter had written in the letter his daughter wouldn't read until she needed it most. Asterisk are not the people who pull the trigger the fastest. They are the ones wise enough to know exactly when not to. Asterisk Evelyn Carter knew exactly when. She pulled the trigger.